of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, roll call, please.
Note for the record that all council members are present.
Okay. Do I have an adoption of tonight's agenda?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Oral communications number 1. So this is an opportunity for anyone who is in the audience who would like to speak before the council on a matter that's not on tonight's agenda. That's right. All right. You want to come on up, all right?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm here too. My name is Jorge Jaramillo with the San Mateo County Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I'm here to extend an invitation to the mayor and the members of the council to attend the San Mateo County Mayor's Diversity Celebration. Each year, all the mayors in San Mateo County come together to celebrate diversity, where they select an individual from their city who is from a diverse group or somebody who works for the members of the different ethnic communities. Last year you did a fantastic job with Chief Macias, and we hope that this year you can also join us on October the 30th. We will send all the details. Well, we already sent it by email, but also the physical invitations. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else for oral communications? Dolores, come on up.
Hi.
And Dolores.
You know what? Everybody is moaning and whining about the increase in the scavenger bill. Now, scavengers are great. We couldn't do it without them. But every year it's almost 9% raise. And I tell people, why don't you go to the council and ask them why? So no one ever does, and I'm tired of hearing people whine. So I'm coming to ask you, why is it almost 9-10% every year when we retired people, we don't even get 3%? So, and I know $6 isn't much, and that's not the point. It just seems like a big raise every year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Doris. I'll have Clay.
The franchise agreement that we have right now has basically 3-year cycles. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Speak louder. The franchise agreement we have with South San Francisco Scavengers has 3-year cycles. So in 2 of those years, it's basically a cost of living increase. And in the 3rd year, they do what they call a market adjustment, and they review the rates of about 30 different garbage companies on the peninsula and in the Bay Area. And then we take an average of those rate increases. And that is, and I think it's all set at about 90% of what that average is. So I'd have to go back and look and see exactly what the percentage rate increases have been. But a lot of the increases in that industry have been because of fuel cost, landfill cost, certainly labor cost, also workers' comp, the variety of different things that drive up their price.
Okay.
But I guess the other flip side of this is that we will have a franchise renewal that will be coming up in a year, and we'll be starting that process fresh.
2014, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we'll have an opportunity to negotiate at that time.
Right.
Okay.
So in other words, the council doesn't set the percentage?
Well, it was the percentage. It was set through a procedure that was adopted in the franchise agreement. So each year that comes before the council for ratification, but it's basically set by that procedure.
So we'll have another opportunity next year to work out a contract.
It doesn't hurt to ask.
No, for sure. No, absolutely. I'm glad that you came down, Dolores.
Yeah, just the synapses of my brain are catching up here. I wasn't expecting the question. It is a good question. One of the things that we have done consistently with the scavengers is that on years in which there's been big spikes because of whatever reason in their industry, we've actually negotiated to phase that in over a couple-year period of time and sometimes to lower that amount. The council has a subcommittee, and then council and staff have worked at that. We're very sensitive to that price issue, even though, as you've indicated, it's not a lot of dollars, but it is a significant percentage increase. And so we've tried to do everything we can to kind of keep the cost under control.
Yeah, I actually think this year they wanted to raise the residential 2% higher than what they were, and we were able to offset that.
We were able to even that out, yeah.
So.
Oh, come on up, Clara.
Good evening.
Hi, Clara.
No.
I'm here to initially, at least, to talk about the budget and the article in the City News. And I'm repeating myself, but I really have difficulty with including the amount that you might get as a result of the fees being charged on the Recology, when the project that Recology is a part of does not yet have an EIR that's even submitted as a draft, and we certainly don't have approval of the project. And as I understand it, the draft EIR is supposed to come out now in November or somewhere around in there, and I don't see how you could possibly not only process the whole application and to the end, and then start collecting fees on something that will begin after the project is approved. There just doesn't even seem physically possible by the 30th of June, and so I don't understand why you're still including $950 or $953 or $53,000 as a part of what you're going to have coming in. What you really have is a $2 million deficit that you don't really want to face, and I don't blame you, and you've had a hard time, and I realize that with all the economic problems that everyone's had, and I do certainly give you credit for doing your best to keep costs down and to be fair to everyone you could be fair within the community, but still, I think it's coercive to yourselves to count on money from a project that you haven't even seen the EIR. And I just, every time somebody's going to bring it up, I'm going to come stand up. So thank you very much for listening. And you know, if things don't go better than they have, then what's going to happen is that you're only going to have a $3 million reserve next year, and the year after that you'll only have $500,000. It's a frightening prospect. I think things are going to get a little better, so I think you're going to get off the hook to some extent, but this is not really, to me, not fair to the people, and I know Clark doesn't agree with me because we've talked about it, but I appreciate your listening to me, and I'll talk to you later.
All right, thank you, Clara. Clay, just to give clarification, we have an existing use, and so the fee is applied to the existing use.
Yeah, the way the business license fee was structured and what was approved by the voters last November is a fee on the existing activity at Recology in Brisbane. And we have had discussions with both Recology and the City of County in San Francisco. At your next meeting on October 1st, we will have a resolution to implement the fee at about $2.1 million for this upcoming year. It will be in place for a period of at least 4 years as we work our way through this application process, with the idea or the concept being that if indeed a project is approved and the project moves forward and ultimately is entitled, that fee will then increase to $3 million and then annually thereafter by some CPI index. So I would agree with the speaker that if this was contingent upon all of the EIR and entitlement aspects being done by next June, absolutely right. We'd be totally correct. There's no way that's going to happen. But that's basically what we've negotiated with San Francisco and Recology, realizing that there has to be a time period in which this takes place, and I think we actually did a good job of getting in place the fee and on the I guess promise of processing the application.
Yes. Clerk, do you wanted to Clerk, did you want to comment on that?
No, I said it very clearly.
Okay.
I mean, as far as, but go ahead.
The only clarification, so the $950,000...
Why don't you come on up, Claire, just so the people at home can hear you.
Yeah.
So the $950,000 is based on the space that is being used for that purpose in Brisbane now? Because I understood that you were trying to obtain 23 acres of land now owned by UPC. That's perhaps my confusion. I didn't realize that we were doing that now in Brisbane. So it's based on what's already being done, is that right?
Right.
That's very good to know, and it would have been good to know sooner.
Well, that's what
but that wasn't clear. Thank you.
All right, Clara. All right, anybody else for oral communications? All right, we'll move on to presentations. And the first one, we have the Brisbane Library Annual Report. Corinne Risley. How you doing, Corinne?
Good. Hi. Mayor, council members, city staff, and members of the public, thank you for allowing me a little time to speak this evening. I am proud to be able to present to you the San Mateo County Library Annual Report for the 2011-2012 fiscal year. It shares just a few stories about what the library is accomplishing in our communities. I hope you enjoy reading through it. For the fourth year in a row, San Mateo County Library has been recognized as a star library by the field's leading professional publication. This year, 7,513 libraries applied for the distinction, and we are one of only 262 libraries awarded the designation. At the Brisbane Library, 100% of library patrons who participated in our surveys expressed their satisfaction with our services thanks to the dedicated and tireless library staff. This year, the entire county, not just the library, has a major initiative to help make sure every child who lives in this county is an excellent reader by third grade. Being able to do so is critical for our children's future successes. At the Brisbane Library, we are striving to raise awareness about the importance of early literacy and all the services we provide to support it. Parents are a child's best teacher, and the public library is a parent's natural partner. We have a wealth of knowledge to empower parents in providing developmentally appropriate experiences to ensure that when a child does begin school, he or she is absolutely ready to begin learning to read. The first 3 years of exploring and playing with books, singing rhymes, listening to stories, recognizing words, and scribbling are core building blocks for language and literacy development. The first 3 years are also when 90% of the brain's development takes place. We have baby story times, toddler story times, preschool story times, and more to share best practices and to have fun. Positive and consistent early experiences with the joys of reading are so influential. Brisbane Library staff members work hard to celebrate and deepen what makes this such a wonderful place in which to live and work. Our programs, events, and collaborations simply would not be possible without our inspiring and driven partners and supporters. And so I especially want to express gratitude to the Friends of the Brisbane Library, the Lions Club, city staff, and the Mothers of Brisbane for all that they do. Thank you for your continued support.
Thank you for the update, Corinne.
Yeah.
Any comments from the council?
I just like the fact that we love our libraries and we appreciate all the work that we're doing both county-wide and our cities to be able to check out books. And I wish one day we wouldn't have to pay whole fee for books and just be able to get any books we want from any of our libraries.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sort of curious about, you were talking about reading, which of course I'm very much in favor of.
Yes.
Retired teacher. But I get the sense that there's a real big shift in library services from the standard hard copy reading books to the use of computers and other kinds of information technology. And I was wondering if you would speak a little to that and how that impacts our current situation in Brisbane.
Okay, so we're at a place where we're trying to support reading and information inquiries in all different types of formats. So we're continuing to support print resources while also augmenting our digital books collection, supporting, enhanced wireless services and other ways of remotely accessing information. But especially what I was saying about children, we anticipate that children will continue to be using print resources. It's very handy for a small child to interact with books in that way.
What about the space allocation with these new technologies? How does that impact you all?
It depends on every community. Or you're talking about planning a new space potentially?
Or,
just using this one?
Do you have enough computers, or are they way overused, or, what's the situation?
Currently, our computers in the library are heavily used. When we plan new libraries, we plan the spaces around people, and so we tend to see a lot of people in our spaces, and whether they're reading or doing other activities, we find that we generally need the same amount of space. But it just depends on the community's input.
Anything else? Well, Corinne, I just wanted to thank you for providing a safe and clean and well-lit, I guess that's probably a line of a bookstore in the city, but, it is a place where the kids gather and they can study and to interact sometimes with their friends and wait for their parents to come home from work. Mm-hmm. And we've had a really nice tradition at our library that this is a place that is safe, and you've carried on that tradition just very well, and thank you for being a part of our community.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corinne. All right. The next item on the agenda, we have another presentation. Oh.
Question from the audience.
Oh. Sorry, Claire, I didn't see that.
I also appreciate the library. In the past, there's been some difficulty with maintaining city records at the library for the duration of time that they might be useful. By that, I mean like the Northeast Ridge Project, for example. And I just wondered if you might ask the library to be sure and maintain the records of the Baylands and perhaps the Sierra Point development as well, so that members of the public can go there and can, for example, EIR, technical reports that the EIR is based on, or I realize we have new methods and perhaps people can use those methods, but there are always some people who do not have access, and if they could have a printed copy that would be maintained and that they would guarantee, rather than throw it out when they had some space pressures. The space pressures, I think, are the problem. So it's just if you would ask that the library keep them for certainly the duration of the project and perhaps a few years thereafter, it would be very helpful, because that has been a problem. People didn't realize the importance of particular documents, and they just tossed them.
All right. Thank you, Clara.
Good point.
Yeah. Hey, Clay, is there a possibility of perhaps being able to store some of those records at City Hall, or maybe we already do?
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we store them here. I think what Clara's referring to is really the public's access,
Right.
During library hours that they wouldn't have access at City Hall.
Right.
But I'll meet with Corinne and see if there's what we can do.
Yeah. You can't store everything there.
Right.
You never know what someone is going to want, but I guess the most
Yeah, it's just
pressing things.
There is, as Clara indicated, there is a space issue there.
Yeah.
And it's important that, these documents are, especially with the Baylands, it's going to be many, many years of study and different iterations of this. So I think it's important that we have a good archive there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, good.
Ray?
Yeah, council does have a history subcommittee. It's Clark and myself, and we've been working mostly on the second 25-year history for Brisbane's 50 years, but after that is completed and distributed, I hope that our committee can address these kind of issues, because we do have a dedicated space now up on the second floor to Brisbane Archives. And I remember when you were on the council that we had an archivist working here, and we have some material that's organized and we have some that isn't, and I discovered that we actually have all the old Brisbane Bees, the newspaper, but they're not really in a position where anybody can come in and look at them, but they're being saved. So we need a system of making sure that they're conserved properly, and that there's some kind of public access process, and everything is established in a good information retrieval system, and we're not there yet, but we certainly are aware of the necessity for saving things. We have some of the old models, believe it or not, of the Civic Center, and you remember all those things. So we have a lot of stuff. It's just not really organized in a way that's well accessible to the public. So I'm hoping that that's one of the issues that we will address.
Cozy Cove Motel sign?
Yeah, we got all kinds of stuff.
I saw that thing.
Yeah. But it's just sitting in a room now, so that's not the best situation. But at least it's saved.
All right.
Fair.
Next item, we have a proclamation declaring October 2012 as Fire Prevention Month. As Chief Johnson is in the audience, so hello, Chief. All right. Whereas the City of Brisbane and North County Fire Authority is committed to ensuring the safety and security of all those living in and visiting our city, and whereas fire is a serious public safety concern both locally and nationally, and homes are the locations where people are at greatest risk from fire, and whereas in 2011, home fires were reported every 85 seconds, killing 2,640 people and injuring 13,350. Whereas thermal burns outnumber scalds nearly 2 to 1, but our children ages 5 and under, scalds outnumber burns roughly 2 to 1. Whereas the City of Brisbane and North County Fire Authority responders are dedicated to reducing the occurrence of home fires and home fire injuries through prevention and protection education, and whereas the City of Brisbane's residents are responsive to public education measures and are able to take personal steps to increase their safety from fire, especially in their homes, and whereas residents should install and maintain smoke detectors, create a home fire escape plan with 2 ways out of every room, and practice it with the whole family. And whereas residents who have planned and practiced a home fire escape plan are more prepared and will therefore be more likely to survive a fire, and whereas the 2012 Fire Prevention Month theme, Have 2 Ways Out, effectively serves to remind us all of the simple actions we can take to stay safer from fire during Fire Prevention Week and year-round. Now therefore, I, Clifford R. Lentz, Mayor of the City of Brisbane, do hereby proclaim October 2012 as Fire Prevention Month, and encourage all City of Brisbane residents to heed the important safety messages of Fire Prevention Month 2012, and to support the many public safety activities and efforts of fire and emergency services. All right, Chief Johnson.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, council members, on behalf of Chief Myers, North County Fire, and the Brisbane firefighters, we appreciate your proclamation and your ongoing continued support for the fire department and our fire prevention efforts. As you have stated, the theme for this year is Have 2 Ways Out, and that is very important. The fact that you should have a escape plan for your home for either a fire or an emergency is a very important step. And it's important that, number 1, you have a plan, number 2, that you discuss that plan with your family, and number 3, you practice that plan. And part of that plan, some of the most important parts of it are, number 1 is to have 2 ways out of every room in your house, including the structure itself. So bedrooms, every room should have 2 ways out. A lot of time that second way out is a window. but there are ladders, there are mechanisms you can install to assist in that effort. Also, it's very, very important to have an exterior meeting point that the whole family is aware of. So if something does happen, they know where to go, and you're not having people running back in the structure to see where somebody is. They have a central meeting place where they can meet outside, where you can count noses and make sure everybody's okay. And finally, really, your whole plan should be based around the fact that you have operational smoke detectors in your home, that you have an emergency escape plan with 2 ways out, and you've practiced that plan. And finally, most recently, one of the additions we have is the addition of carbon monoxide detectors in the home. That is also a major importance for home safety. And although it's not directly fire related, it is directly related to the fact that we respond to medical emergencies. And so we would hope that people would also look at making sure they have carbon monoxide detectors in their homes. And then I would like to remind Council that October is Fire Prevention Month, and we will be conducting tours through all the schools with the fire companies in the second and third weeks of October. Those tours are being, or visits are being scheduled right now, and the schools will have the schedule of wherever that is. We're trying to meet their schedules, not our schedules. But we're trying to do that in the second and third week of October. And then, again, I'd like to thank you for your support of the organization, what we try to do for the community. I know Brisbane is a very small, kind of hands-on community, and we try to be as much as we can that. As a bigger organization, sometimes we find it a little bit harder than we would like it to be, but we try our best. And again, thank you very much for the proclamation.
Yeah, I know you guys have been a great partner. Any comments or questions for the Chief?
No, just thank you, Chief. You know, I mean, you guys do a good job in keeping abreast of what's going on out there, you know, and from a safety aspect, and I know you work with our OES officer over there, Randy Bro, and so I know that it's always about preparation, and we can never do enough in that area, I guess, you know, just individual people, you know, in their own home, so.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. All right, moving on to the consent calendar. Are there any items that anyone would like to remove?
I'd like to remove A and B.
A, B, Terry.
Motion to approve C, D, and E.
You know, I would like item E. I just wanted to get some clarification. So.
Okay.
And then my motion to C and D.
Okay.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, Terry. Item A.
On the minutes of August 27th, on item D, Caltrain application for electronic billboard. I'd like to add the language that two of the council members were not in accordance with the studying of the proposal. And I'm not quite sure of the language that we'd want to use.
Just put it at the end that two council members didn't want to see it. Is that how?
Yeah.
Two council
I would
members.
like to be on record as not thinking that it's a good idea to study, personally. And so I would like to add that we had concerns with the plan.
Right.
You can say that
we
council
feel
members,
warranted.
Mayor Lentz and council members Conway and Miller agreed to do the study, and council members O'Connell and Richardson
Had raised concerns that need to be addressed.
didn't want.
Okay, but you're still in favor of at least studying it.
That's what I'm saying, that Terry and I have raised concerns, that those concerns need to be addressed.
Yeah, no, but
So-
Terry, you're saying that you would prefer that we not even study it,
That was my
we not do it.
intention when I voted.
We actually
didn't
took a
take
vote,
a
right?
vote, so there wasn't a vote to take.
Yes, we
But
did.
I thought we did.
3-2.
I would be happy with that for my own record, that I had concerns with the proposal
Yes.
and did not feel it was appropriate for Brisbane.
Okay.
I'm comfortable with that language.
Okay, and you're in agreement that you don't
Yes.
think that it should be studied either?
That's the way she voted,
That's what
right?
I would-
I mean, did we take it?
I'll check let me go back and check it and make sure that I got that.
Vote whether
didn't
we
have a
wanted to
vote.
study it or not.
Those sentiments were clearly expressed, so...
Yeah, I remember that, so let me just go back and make sure. If there was a vote, I'll put that in.
And then
Yeah,
I have
that's fine.
a question, perhaps this is more for protocol. On our closed session items, at the end of the closed session, I'm under the understanding that we should come in and announce if we had made any decisions at that time. And so I see that we're announcing it now, that there was a decision made on the 27th, but I thought that we needed to do that at the time of the closed session if there was a decision made.
Technically, that is correct. You come out of closed session and announce any action that may have been taken. Usually the auditorium is empty by then, so we've kind of done it in the conference room rather than having everybody come back in here. But that is correct. You should announce any action taken, and all the more reason why it's referred to in the minutes.
So we're now announcing it sort of after the fact, and I'm just not quite sure of the protocol on that.
Well, if there was anybody waiting outside, we would have invited them in and advised them that the meeting has now reconvened and announce any action taken. But what usually happens is the council adjourns to closed session. The audience tends to leave the building and doesn't stick around to see if there's anything to report. And I'd have to say more often than not, there is nothing to report.
More often than not, there is nothing to report, but in the future, if we have the closed sessions prior to the scheduled meeting, is it appropriate for the council to come in at the start of this meeting and announce any decisions that were made?
Yes, it is.
And can we make that the standard protocol for meetings that are closed session that are held prior to a regular meeting?
When it's before, yes, absolutely. You can
Okay.
start off the regular meeting by announcing either that no action was taken or any action that should be reported out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So you want to move approval of the minutes?
With that, I'll move approval of the minutes.
Cliff?
Oh,
Cliff?
Oh, Clara.
As amended, right?
she's,
Yeah, please come.
What was the announcement? What was the announcement that you're talking about that I haven't heard you make an announcement tonight, and you said...
Oh, this was about
It wasn't-
27th.
on the 27th, we made an announcement that we took action to deny a claim.
Thank you.
And perhaps after this, we can add an agenda item to make an announcement on the closed session we had prior.
Okay. So we had a motion and second?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So I asked to remove item E.
Wait a minute.
Oh, wait a minute.
She asked for...
Oh, that's right, you had another one.
Terry,
Sorry,
I did.
Terry B.
Yeah, right.
You're right.
Yes, on item B, on the investment report, I would, again, and it's probably going to be a perennial question, I would like a update on the Baylands EIR and truck hauling fees, if you have one for that amount. Is the figure listed here the current and fairly true figure for now?
This is the figure that was as of July 31st. There's an item later on the agenda which talks to it as of August 28th.
Okay, thank
So
you.
you'll have an even more up-to-date information than what this was.
Later on the agenda. Okay.
With that, I'll move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. All right, item E.
You have a slip.
That's gonna come up.
Oh, I'm sorry. The old I have you want to talk about the Oakdale term and then investment fund report? Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's what we
You're right. Okay. Sorry about that. You had it as number 2, so I was looking at...
Right.
Should have been in the opposite order, huh?
Yeah.
Been easier.
That's okay.
Actually, it's the same topic that Ms. O'Connell wanted to talk about, and I have heard Stewart's answer. I guess I would ask the question, in the Baylands revolving account, there's a balance of it's around $276,000, that's around that, positive, and minus, as of July 31st, and minus $683 in the EIR account. And I just wondered, in the Baylands revolving account, and I imagine this will be later, are they up to date on their fees, number one, and you've never said what the payment schedule is. And I don't know if they're paying back $1,000 a month or $100,000 a month. And I don't know if that's public information, but I'd kind of like to know, because we've been told that they're on a schedule to repay. And it'd be interesting to know what that schedule of payments is.
Yeah, definitely, you know, if you have some time, you know, if you could wait for this, because we're going to get into it,
Okay.
pretty good discussion.
That's fine.
All right, thanks, Clara. All right. Now moving on to item E. So, let's see, where's that? Okay. When we offer the community park for a function, for a fundraiser, do we ask for what the money is raised for, and and also do we check to see if the nonprofit is, if it says it's from Brisbane, that it is a Brisbane nonprofit?
To the latter question, yes, we do verify that it's a Brisbane nonprofit. To the former question about do we check on how they use fundraising dollars, no, we don't audit that type of thing.
Okay. And then the Latino Commission, I mean, I'm sure they're a fine organization, though I haven't heard of them before, but they've been before us. This is their second time, so they did it last year.
Yeah, they've been in Brisbane for quite a bit of time. The term commission is one that I wasn't familiar with, but the organization has been there for quite some time. And is Chief Macias here? I think she's had dealings with them.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. Yes, the Latino Commission, they moved into Brisbane probably around 1996.
Oh my goodness, all right.
Saying approximately, and they're a residential, long-term, both long-term and short-term substance abuse rehabilitation program for women. And some of them are volunteer. They can come in and volunteer if they have substance abuse issues, or they can be court-ordered by the court as part of their rehabilitation or probation sentence from the court.
Okay.
They do go on a sliding scale, so some of them either the insurance it's covered through the insurance, or there are some funds that are provided by the county. San Mateo County pays some of the funds, but I think like anything else, their funds are being cut, so they're looking for ways to fundraise to help with those on a sliding scale.
Oh, that's great. Has the Latino Commission ever become? Have they ever come before the city to help bring greater awareness to what they're trying to provide their clients?
I'm not sure. I think at the beginning when they first came into the community, they did, but I don't recall that they've been back since.
All right.
May I add something to this? I think it's just like Jericho Project. Isn't that something like that they help substance abuse, residential treatment, and the people who live there? The residential part of it is in Daly City, but the office and work here in Brisbane, and they work to pay for their therapy, some of them.
It is a residential here in Brisbane, so they do reside here at the residence here in Brisbane, and some of them do the long-term. Once they complete their program, they do have additional long-term stay. There are other homes in San Mateo County that are also part of the Latino Commission that they can go for the long-term.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. You know, sometimes, you think of our town, because it's so small, that and you don't hear about it, that we just don't do those types of things that happens in the larger cities. So it's nice to know that that we're doing our part to help those who are less fortunate.
And they've also,
on their feet.
Mayor, they've also taken in some of our own local residents as part of the program. So I think it's a wonder. It's been a very positive program, and I know their statistics have shown that it certainly does work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Thank you.
Chief.
And that's also why they want to do this in our park, was to invite the whole community to understand what they do. They will have information there. They will also be giving guided tours to their office in the Brisbane Village. So they want the community to know what they're doing, and they had this last year to try and get more information out, and they're doing it again to get more information out.
That's great. Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve item E.
Second.
All's in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Moving through the consent calendar, now we're at new business. The first item is to approve term sheet with Oakdale Irrigation District for water transfer. Staff report, please.
Honorable Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, council members, good evening. So the term sheet that's before you tonight, I want to be very clear, is not a binding agreement. What the term sheet is a general framework that outlines goals, principles, and that provides basic project definitions so that a CEQA review may be commenced. In addition to and following CEQA review, there are 3 agreements that must be developed before the Oakdale Irrigation District, OID, could transfer water to Brisbane. The first one is an exchange agreement. Under the exchange agreement, Oakdale delivers water directly to the Modesto Irrigation District for their use, for their customers. Modesto then exchanges that water volume they have in a shared reservoir that they share with SFPUC amongst other customers. The next agreement would be a wheeling agreement. The wheeling agreement would be SFPUC delivering this water that's been transferred to them to Brisbane. The last agreement, and perhaps the most important one for us, is the developer funding agreement, because within this agreement, and I want to be clear that all of these agreements are as yet to be developed and are certainly subject to this council's approval, but under this agreement, UPC pays all the costs for the developing the agreements, which would include the legal fees, which would include the CEQA review, etc., and they would also pay the cost, all of the costs for the delivered water. In addition to that, UPC is going to have to agree to build a recycled water system for any proposal, for any project that may be approved out at the Baylands. So let me kind of go back to the beginning, if you will, for a moment. Why are we here? Well, the reason we're here is that UPC has to demonstrate that water is available for their development. There's a state law that's referenced in the staff report, and it talks about the amount of time period and such, the term. Brisbane cannot provide that water right now. We don't have anywhere near that amount of water. That's never been our capacity. It's never been the supply agreement that we have with San Francisco. The previous efforts that UPC has made to try and find water, a number of years ago they funded a joint recycled water feasibility study with South San Francisco and SFPUC that allowed Brisbane to participate in that. They funded a study for the feasibility of using local groundwater in the Upper West Side Basin. They made inquiries regarding the availability of the West Side Basin's southwest portion. And they also approached BAUSCA agencies that currently use less water than their supply guarantee from SFPUC. None of those efforts were fruitful. None of them demonstrated that water was going to be available. So after having taken those steps, they then engaged staff and consultants to search for outside water. And they approached OID, Oakdale Irrigation District, and then Irrigation District staff and city staff talked and started to develop what we think some of the general guiding principles might be for an agreement that would be approved in future. So the pricing and the terms, the total maximum volume of this future agreement is 2,400 acre-feet. And I want to be clear that 400 of those acre-feet are not intended to be for UPC. They are intended to be for future development at Sierra Point. There are 3 parcels out there that have yet to be developed. They don't have water identified for them either. So the city would make that water available to those developments if they chose, and they would have the same cutoffs and the same timing to purchase them that Baylands does, and they would have the same stipulations that UPC is going to have for water delivered to the Baylands, as they would be responsible for the full freight of that cost. The way the agreement is presently envisioned, under the first 5 years, there's a reservation price. So that's just to hold the water available is $100 an acre foot. Also, during the first 5 years, if the city wanted to take water, if the developer wanted us to take water for them, we would pay $500 an acre foot. This is to OID, to Oakdale Irrigation District. At year 6, a decision has to be made as to what the ultimate volume is going to be for the remainder of the term of the agreement. Once we get to year 6, the contract really becomes a take or pay contract, if you will, because regardless of whether you take an acre foot of water, if you've said, I want X amount to be committed for, you have to pay for it. The term of the contract, as it's written right now, the first term would be for 50 years with 25-year extensions after that. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions from the council.
All right, questions for Randy?
I do. Just some clarifications, Randy. When you were referring to Sierra Point on undeveloped parcels,
yes, sir.
What is it? Healthcare Partners?
Healthcare Partners, yes, sir.
Is not included in that?
It is not included in the list of people who do not have water allocated for them.
Right.
The city presently has a development agreement with Healthcare Partners. They have an allocation water amount.
Okay. Just for clarification, because I know there's some folks that thought that, that was included.
Yes, sir. I believe that was an email correspondence.
Just kind of going through some numbers, because we're talking 2,400 acre feet of water. An acre foot is 325,851 gallons.
You always take it to more digits than I do, sir. Okay. I can only remember 325,900.
Then a unit by which we, buy and sell water
to our customers, a billing unit, yes, right.
748 gallons.
Exactly.
And so you divide that into there, comes out to like 435 units of water.
Right, for an acre foot, sure.
Right.
Yes.
And for a purchase price of it is $500. And so, if you take that, it comes out that we'd be paying like $1.15.
Correct, per unit.
Water.
Right.
And then there's a transfer fee that is yet to be negotiated.
Right. That would be part of what's referred to in here as a wheeling agreement with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission.
Okay. And do you have a number of what we currently pay on water?
The effective rate as of July this year, we pay $2.93 a unit.
$2.93. So everything's subject to the transfer fee, and part of our delivery is treating and and getting it here so that it's potable water, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And this would be inclusive in that when we develop that agreement?
That would be inclusive in the development of the agreement with SFPUC, yes, sir, because what happens is everybody can recognize, I'm not trying to be smart, everybody can recognize from the name that the Oakdale Irrigation District is an irrigation district, so they provide water for irrigation quality, not for potable quality. Right. So it gets transferred from one irrigation district to another irrigation district to SFPUC. Most of that, those last two ones are really just an accounting transfer. But then once it goes to SFPUC has to provide potable water to its customers who are member agencies of BAUSCA, where we have two different agreements with them. We have that master agreement, and then we have our individual water sales contracts with them. So that's how the water ends up, that's how the excess irrigation water that Oakdale Irrigation District has ends up becoming potable drinking water for people in the city of Brisbane.
And, in the staff report under the fiscal impact, I'm just going there, it says on the second sentence, it says the cost for delivered water will be borne by UPC. It says the requirement for UPC to pay these costs will be memorialized in a developer funding agreement.
Yes, sir.
And saying for delivered water, is that a correct statement? I mean, if there was no water that ever came here for those first 5 years, and there's a $100 fee, who pays that?
They would still.
Okay. And so this isn't necessarily, it's correct in saying that it's delivered water, but it needs to go a little bit further and say that even if the water's not delivered, that they will be paying all the fees?
Well, it's them paying the reservation price. It depends. I guess it depends on how we want to define delivered. We could say delivered is delivered in that you have it in a bank account available to use at Oakdale Irrigation District, and for that you are paying a reservation price in the first 5 years. Yes, UPC would pay that. You can also have water that is released to MID, to SFPUC, thence to Brisbane. That water has a different price. UPC pays that too.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a price to pay, UPC pays the price. That's the intent as we would be moving forward to develop those agreements before we bring them to council.
And this being quite a bit of water too, is Brisbane would also have the right to sell it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And okay. Any takers? No.
Well, you know, if you look right now through, I haven't checked the recent sheets, but as you go through the member agencies of BAUSCA, just within the Hetch Hetchy delivery system that SFPUC uses, there's always a handful of folks that have more water than they use, and there's always a handful of folks that are using more water than they have a guaranteed entitlement to. And so I think there's definitely a short-term market for that, and there may even be a long-term market for that water.
Okay.
I have a question.
One more. Just Hal, this is your question on the actual agreement itself. For clarification, because Randy said that it's not binding. This is not a binding agreement in any way. Can you just kind of explain how these contractual, what this actually does from a legal
This agreement, more than anything else, is really a precondition needed to allow the city to complete its EIR on the Baylands. As Randy indicated, under state law, you are required to show that you have water available. You're not required to have a binding contract at that point, but you need to show that there is a source which is available, and that is the function of this term sheet. It says repeatedly in there, it is not binding, it is not a contract on either party. If the whole Baylands project went away, or if we found a different water source that was better for any reason, we could simply say we're not going to proceed and execute a final binding contract. There is enough detail in here so that the EIR consultant will know what the quantity of water is, what the approximate cost is. We still have some terms to be negotiated, as Randy indicated, the cost of the delivery through San Francisco PUC. So there are a lot of terms that have yet to be negotiated, and there has been no final contract executed. This basically sets forth a framework. And it's a framework with enough information so the EIR consultant can satisfy the state requirement of saying, yes, we've identified a source of water, we've identified the availability of that water, and we've identified that there is enough of a quantity to meet the projected needs of the project. And once we've done that, the EIR can proceed, and this is basically what's holding up the final preparation of the draft EIR, is being able to say we do have a water supply source which satisfies the requirements of CEQA.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. I have a question. Does the state law that you were talking about, Hal, about that requires to set the framework and so forth, does AB 32 or SB 375 have any impact on this? That if it gets repealed, any changes that happen to those two, would this impact us at all in any way?
No, I don't think so, because this is basically a CEQA-based requirement, and also the courts have said the same thing, is that you don't have a complete EIR unless you've covered all of the infrastructure needed for the project to move forward, and water is one of the most critical aspects of that project. So I think it's as much of a CEQA-based requirement as anything else.
Okay. My next question is to Randy. This item is going to be in before the BAUSCA board this Thursday.
No.
What do you anticipate? How do you think it's going to go?
It's actually going to be before the Oakdale Irrigation District Board tomorrow morning, and I would suspect that it will be a topic of conversation at the Bauska Board meeting on Thursday, though, even though it's not on their formal calendar, but I suspect it may come up.
There's one point that's not in the staff report, and I know Randy was intending to mention it, but I think it ought to be mentioned, is that from OID's perspective, they have a history of selling water to agencies such as Brisbane and other agencies. In the past, they've sold 41,000 acre feet of water. This contract and others like it are important to them because basically it assures the supply of water. The money that they're receiving from this contract and others similar to it is used by OID to improve their infrastructure, to improve their facilities, and to expand their ability to provide water. So in that sense, they're no different than the city in the terms of we need to go and fix our pipes, and we need to fix our tanks and other things of the infrastructure to deliver water. Well, they have the same issue. They need to improve their infrastructure and their facilities and to expand those facilities. So in some respects, the money we're paying will actually serve to not only preserve but possibly also increase the general supply of water. So it's not that water is being diverted from another source. I've been told that the amount of water Brisbane is receiving is about the amount that evaporates from their system every year. So it's not a case of some place being run dry because the water is being diverted to Brisbane. It's just the opposite. It serves to guarantee the continued supply of water and protect that supply and even enhance it.
Excuse me, may I follow up? Okay, there's a 325,000 gallon that we're talking about here. Let's say down the line in the future they need 500,000 gallon. How do they go get the rest? Do they go into the competitive market, or how does that work?
So why don't I take a shot at that?
Go ahead.
So you're talking about UPC's needs out at the Baylands, right? So that's why there's the 5-year term, ma'am. Because what that does is it gives the developer basically a 5-year period to finalize his needs. And if he hasn't got it by then he has to make a pretty good guess, because it's a guess that he's going to be committed to. Certainly the city is going to, we haven't talked yet about what the mechanism might be of how we're going to ensure that those payments come to the city, so the city is not financially liable without some way of extracting that from the developer, but they're going to have finalized their plans within that time frame. But once you hit year 6, there's no requirement in the agreement for OID to give us more water, but at present time, we have a willing seller. We're trying to determine if we have a willing buyer. They may or may not be in that same position 5 years from now if they want to do more water. I don't envision the city ever needing any more water than what we're talking about here. We've got enough water for our existing uses, for our existing non-major development expansion that's planned, for what's anticipated for our single-family dwelling growth and such through 2030. So we're in fine shape there. But it's, as I mentioned in the staff report, Brisbane basically has a 1 million gallon a day water supply agreement. When you get a big project that comes in that has a number that's 1 to 2 times more than that, depending upon what the project really ends up being, you're not going to conserve that. You're not going to conserve twice as much water as you use. You're not even going to conserve the same amount of water you use. It's not feasible to do that within our system.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Sarah?
I've got several concerns on this. So basically, Brisbane now uses or has allocated about 1 million gallons per day, and this is anticipating a maximum usage or a maximum water request of about double that. So our water size, if this were enacted and the water used, we would become 3 times the size. Our water department would need to have the capacity to deliver 3 times the amount of water within its system.
Yes, ma'am. It's a true statement that if we were to go from 1 MGD, adding 2 would be 3, so we would be delivering to our customers 3 times the amount of water we presently deliver.
And on the actual draft term sheet agreement here, first of all, the first question I have is it describes the project to OID as a mixed-use development, and exactly how does that define mixed use for me? Can you define mixed use in this term?
Sure. We were playing Rochambeau here as to whether it would be the planning director or the city attorney to do that.
I've seen some communications expressing concerns about the use. OID has no interest or regulation or control over how Brisbane designates its land use. That's in here just for purposes of giving a rough identification of the process, but this agreement from OID's side is only to supply a certain quantity of water at a certain price over a certain period of time. It does not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it does not in any way establish any control over land use. It does not dictate how the Baylands is to be developed or what land uses the city of Brisbane may ultimately allow to be placed there. This is only the water supply. It might have reference to them in terms of certain, industrial uses or commercial uses may use more water than residential uses, but really none of that matters because, as Randy indicated, we've got 5 years to figure that all out, or UPC does, and then once we have a quantity, then that's it, and there's nothing in the agreement that indicates how that quantity should be applied.
Well, and I could be wrong on this, but any water transfer within the
SFPUC?
The SFPUC needs to be approved by different agencies. It needs to be approved by the PUC and by BOSQA, and don't different uses of water have a higher degree of priority? So wouldn't that make a difference in this agreement, what we're calling it, on how it moves through the approval process through those other agencies?
Yeah, I'm going to take a shot at it, ma'am. And I certainly would never tell a council member that they're wrong. That's not my forte. So, if I understand correctly, your question would be, is it more whether we're taking the water, or is it in the event that we might sell some excess water from this arrangement that we have?
Either one.
Either one. Okay, so if we're taking the water, this does not require BOSQA's approval. If we're taking the water through SFPUC system, it requires an agreement with them. In a similar vein, because this water is not Raker Act water, it's not water that the federal government approved SFPUC to take, and then it was sometime in the 80s when there was a lawsuit that determined that no, actually the members of what was then BAWA also have rights to that water. It's not that water. It's different water. It's actually senior water. It has a senior water right to it, so BOSQA doesn't have any say on that. The only reason SFPUC has a say on it is because right now, the way we're envisioning to get it here is to use their existing system from Hetch Hetchy to deliver it. So what it's being used for, it doesn't really matter. I believe in the recital, the way it's considered right now, it's described as municipal and industrial M&I water, which is a distinctly different term from a planning use. In water parlance, for reference, you can go to the State Water Resources Control Board where they start to define it. Municipal water means water that's intended for use in a potable water supply system. Industrial water means water that's going to a business that relies on water as one of the primary bases for whatever it's manufacturing. So this is all M&I water.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, I think I understand the term mixed use sometimes it gets people concerned about housing. So I think in that third recital, we could just eliminate the term mixed use and just have it say brownfield development.
Sure. I will be quite confident that OID would not have any objections to that.
Okay. have concerns about that insinuating that it's for homes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Understood. I got it.
And then, so for year 1 through 5, we're going to be paying a $240,000 reservation fee, whether we use the water or not, based on the 100 gallons, $100 per acre.
Per acre foot, yes. UPC will be paying that price for years 1 through 5.
Someone will be paying for it.
Someone that looks like that gentleman over there, ma'am, sitting in front of you.
For it. And then after that...
Sitting in front of you, cringing.
After that, if in year 5, and I had the date written down, I think it's on another piece of paper here, if we want to keep that reservation for the water, we bump up in price for the full reservation amount. And that brings it to $1.2 million per year if we
keep the 2,400.
If we keep that number.
Your math seems right. Yes, ma'am.
And again, that's use it or not.
Correct. It is. It's take or pay. Sure. I'll use that term.
And that's not including any price if the water's delivered for it to be wheeled and
that's true.
Processed and
that's true.
And that kind of thing.
That's true.
So
the number that the developer will have to pay in that case starts to go up even above the numbers you've calculated. There will undoubtedly be some adder as a result of taking it through SFPUC system, and the developer will be responsible for that.
Okay. So is the effective date of, and it says on January 1st of the 6th year following the effective date, is that January 1st, 2018?
It depends if and when we sign it, ma'am.
Well, isn't this on the assumption if we were to approve it tonight, that would be January 1st?
The OID board would have to approve it as well, ma'am, and I don't think they're going to. The OID board has to approve it as well, ma'am.
Okay.
But Randy, the effective...
Oh, and I'm sorry, and I'm hearing Hal talking in the back, so let me, if I may interrupt. So it's the effective date of the water transfer, not the effective date of this term sheet. Yeah. So the term sheet starts to set the pieces in motion. So again, and in many ways, it's really analogous to any other project you would build. I mean, think about if we were building a water tank. Well, if we're going to build a water tank somewhere, and I pick water tank because I'm a utility guy, if you're going to build a water tank, you're going to have to do environmental review on it. Before you can do environmental review, you've got to develop enough of a project scope and a project description so you know what the heck you're looking at, so you can reasonably imagine what the impacts would be and truly comply with CEQA. So that's what this is doing here. This term sheet develops enough of the description of what an ultimate project might look like so that you can do the CEQA review, so that you can really do the hydrologic modeling that's going to be required, because some of that will be required. Certainly, I would suggest that Oakdale Irrigation District has done most of their environmental work within their system, but I think that within the Tuolumne, there's certainly some additional hydrologic work that has to be done to look and see this 2,400 acre feet, is that a challenge? Are there environmental impacts that need to be mitigated, yes or no? That's got to be done. So that's what this does. And at the same time, it allows the parties, and there are multiple parties that don't sign this, but that are necessary to be brought on board, that have to enter into an agreement so that this can happen.
Okay.
It's not to say you get so-called final binding agreement that the term starts to run, and we are quite a ways from there. It's probably after our EIR is done and everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that will come before the council for approval. So.
Well, now's the time to find out if we have issues with it.
No, absolutely. I'm just saying the question is, when does the time start running? And that's when it starts running.
Time starts running not with this agreement, but with the final agreement.
Correct.
And then do you have any idea of what the cost of wheeling and processing the water will do to our rates here? Because don't the rates have to be shared over the entire community?
No. So let me answer, and I think I'm going to say no in both of those cases. Number one, I don't really have an idea of what the rate is going to be from SFPUC. I'll bet they have a number in mind, and I have a different number in mind. And with the council's pleasure, I'd really rather not describe that because that's a negotiation that's going to have to go on. Okay. And I'd rather they not understand what my theory is later on that. But as we've listed in here, it's the intent in the developer funding agreement that the developer bear the full cost for this. So the impact on the Brisbane ratepayer is intended to be zero on their water bills.
Okay. And then I'm sure I'll have more questions after we've heard from the applicant and from the other council members, but on the environmental review section, item 13, it says the expenses of environmental review and approval for both OID and Brisbane will be paid entirely by Brisbane.
Right.
It does not mention the developer. It does not mention anyone else. It says Brisbane.
That's right, ma'am, and if I may, I'd refer you back to the developer funding agreement, which is paragraph 9 on page 4, which says the agreement is contingent upon an agreement between Balin's project developer and Brisbane for developer to fully fund the development of all agreements and associated costs for delivery. So there are a couple of things going on in here. One of them is the terms, and I'm going to try to avoid using the word agreement because this isn't an agreement, it's a term sheet. It's developing a project description, letting the environmental process begin. It's establishing the terms between Brisbane and OID, and some of those terms that are in there are agreements with parties that, again, aren't signatory to this term sheet. So that's why, in the one hand, OID wants language that says, look, we'll sell you this water, guys, but you've got to pay the cost of the environmental review. And our response is, at least the way it's drafted up now in the term sheet, is that's fine, but before we entered into any final agreement with you, we're going to have an agreement with the developer. It's a condition precedent that we have this agreement with the developer that they agree to pay all these costs.
It makes me nervous. It makes me nervous.
There's a lot of moving parts to this, ma'am. I certainly understand that. I'd be happy to explain as much as I can of it for you. It really is.
And it makes me nervous that Brisbane's on the hook for it to begin with, and then maybe chasing money, which we've had to do in the past, to recuperate the funds that we've expended. And I think that should be addressed up front before it goes further than later. So those are the questions I've had.
And ma'am, if I may, I really agree with you 100% on that, and that is certainly the intent of the developer funding agreement. We are not, staff is certainly not going to recommend an agreement with OID be brought to this council unless we've got as rock solid an agreement as we could develop, as we can put into place with the developer to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Ray?
Do we have a draft of a developer funding agreement?
No, sir, we do not.
You're comfortable with that?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because the ultimate project that's envisioned is the water transfer doesn't happen unless this council approves a funding agreement that you're satisfied with.
The funding agreement will need to include some pieces we don't have yet, so it would incorporate whatever obligations there are under the wheeling agreement. And like Randy said, the city is not going to be bound to anything until the developer agreement is in place. It's just I don't think we have all the details at this point to put that agreement together. And the function of this document is mainly to let the EIR go forward. That EIR may have some content in it that will impact this agreement in some way. So it's in some respects a little premature to have the developer agreement until we know all of the issues and things that need to be included in that agreement. You know,
I'll give you my views after we have public input. Yeah. Secondarily, why did you pick this 6-year magic, we're going to know everything to commit ourselves for the next 45 years? I mean, how was that arrived at? What makes people think that they're really going to know what they're going to need for the next 45 years?
That was actually a term imposed by OID. That was as long as they were willing to have a reservation-only price, because it affects their certainty for their system, their ability to make their own business decisions. They didn't want it to go on forever. They felt that they needed to know at some point in time, and the time point they picked was 5 years. After 5 years, they want to know how much water it is that they have to deliver.
Okay, well, when the developer comes up, I'd like to find out whether they're comfortable with that or not, because, you know, predicting what you're going to need for sure permanently, that is 45 years, strikes me as making quite a commitment. So I'd like to know what they say about that.
Sure.
Okay, that's all I want to ask right now. I'll look forward to the public comment and the mayor's comments, and then we'll talk about what we think about all this.
All right. Before I ask my comments or questions to staff, council members, did you want to add anything else? Or?
No, we can wait.
Okay. All right. Been some good questions. Let's see. Randy, so for Sierra Point, we have estimated future needs to be at 0.4 MGD. And so that's for these 3 parcels.
Yes, sir.
They're still undeveloped. The largest parcel is owned by UPC.
That's true.
Okay. If the Baylands project continues to be delayed and we're not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but we have Sierra Point, which has already been approved for development. We need this water, and maybe development will happen sooner out at Sierra Point, which is probably obvious. How does this mechanism help with getting water to those parcels that we need it?
So from the future date, when the City Council and the OID might approve a water transfer agreement, we would have 5 years to talk with the developers at UPC who presently do not have development agreements that include a guaranteed water delivery from the city. We would give them the option to purchase that price. I would imagine, and I think I'm imagining this quite clearly, that the terms would be generally consistent with what we're going to impose upon the developer at UPC, that they're paying full freight and that they're going to guarantee their payments in some form or another. And if they choose to accept that, then we bring that agreement to the council and they have water, and then we notify OID that here is your water schedule of delivery that this customer is on for this amount of time starting on this date. If they decide that the volume they want is none, or they don't want to sign on to the agreement, or they think they're going to magically get water from somewhere else, then at the end of year 5, when we have to make a final decision, we delete that 400 off of any future scheduled delivery amount. Okay. And it no longer is available or paid for.
All right. Are there other options for those parcels out at Sierra Point where they might be able to do some ways of saving, conserving water, where then there would be enough water in our current available source where they could then use it?
The question is really temporal, and then I say that because it really does matter at what point in time we are, how built out we are, how good are our projections that we already have.
Sure.
Thinking that we're going to get
for you too as well.
Thinking that we're going to get pretty close to that 1 MGD we have, but you know, it would be my preference as the water utility manager to not get so close that I don't have some buffer, because it's good to have buffer, because things just happen, shortages happen, droughts happen. I like to have a little something in my pocket. It's always better to be able to give people a little bit of water than to say, sorry, that's it, we maxed it out. Part of the challenge that we end up with, and that we end up with new developments, and I've talked about this at a couple of different conferences and such that I've been to, is that we do such a good job of imposing strict water conservation requirements on development now that they have zero elasticity. And what I mean by that is if you make a development put in low-flow, no-flow toilets, if you make them put in zero-escape, then the only use they really end up with is hand washing and fill in the coffee maker. So when they get to a point that they've got to cut back or try and conserve more, their option is to bring water from home to make coffee with, because the water balance is just that tight. Now, having said that, I'm not going to sit here and try and tell you that I think we have the perfect, best water conservation use there is. But if you look at the city of Brisbane's use, if you just look at it as a combined utility system, both Brisbane and GVMID, and you compare it to the other users of BAUSCA, and you create a list that starts number one at the top, who uses the least amount of water per capita, and who uses the most. We're third on that list. We use 50 gallon per cap day. That is an incredibly low amount. That is a really amazing amount of conservation and effort that this community does. Now, granted, we also have to factor in that we live in a different microclimate than other areas. We are not the same as some of the very southern, some of the far eastern members of BAUSCA, for instance, who live in a much hotter climate. Okay, we do not have some of the larger single-family homes that is prevalent in some of the other municipalities. But again, this is our use. 50 gallon per cap day is starting to get to be not very much water that an individual uses. You know, I know that my water use certainly has gone up when my teenage boys were younger, because they would spend half an hour or so in the shower, and now that started to dial down, even my use has got down to, you know, the traditional 5 units or less a month. But to think that we could conserve anywhere near hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, I don't see it, not within our system. And then oftentimes, if I may continue, oftentimes people say, well, why don't you conserve it somewhere else? Well, there are a couple of problems with that, because number one, there's a capital cost to pay to conserve somewhere else. There's an O&M cost to pay to conserve somewhere else. There's the reality of taking credit for that and getting it transferred. Can you find somebody who's a willing partner to do that, who would in fact be interested in doing that? And there's also the very real concern, and I know we've talked about this with our Water and Sewer Subcommittee before, is that as all of these municipalities go along and become better and better at conserving, you get to a point where you have conserved down so low, but yet we haven't fixed the structure of our water rate system, where you have a fixed rate, because you've got X amount of pipe you've got to maintain, you got X amount of people you have to have in the system, and then you have a variable rate that's been based on the usage that you have, how many units. Well, for years, and we're not the only one that do it, everyone does this, is that we put the negative incentive in the rate use because we were trying to force conservation. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is now, if you had no use, you wouldn't cover your fixed capital costs. So that's the third problem you end up with if you try to conserve somewhere else. Even if you could find a willing partner who would do that, you'd have that cost, you'd have that annual fee, the annuity that they'd want paid, you'd have a transfer rate, and on top of that, you would most likely have a negative impact on their rates. They would be using less water, and it would be likely that their water rates would have to go up because they'd have to capture their fixed costs somehow.
Well, is there a possibility that if we agreed, you know, if we had the agreement with UPC to use that OID water, that volume of water could potentially lower the costs for Brisbane residents and the existing commercial use, because we'd have this excess money to be applied to these fixed costs?
So I think the scenario that's most likely, I don't think that you could have an immediate short-term impact on lowering existing Brisbane water rates. But what typically happens is, and again, it's one of the challenges that we've talked about many times, is we have a very small system, so we don't have very good economies of scale. We don't have the scale to spread things out over. So oftentimes as systems grow, your economies of scale become bigger. So when you start applying your CIP cost to your water rates, as you start applying and fixing your unfunded depreciation, and you start fixing that, you're spreading that over many, many more users. So what you see happening is, instead of when you're in a small system, your rate increase can be a very steep slope. That slope becomes doesn't become horizontal, but it becomes much less steep. So what it does, by increasing your system, increasing your economies of scale, your future cost increases to your customer are a lower percentage than it would be if they were to stay a small system by themselves.
Okay. All right. I'm going to shorten my questions so we can get to the community. Effective date. The water transfer, do we have the option of being able to sell the water based on irrigation standards as well as running it through SFPUC and selling it as drinking water standards? Or do we only have one, the drinking water standard?
The way this is envisioned presently, it would only be potable water.
And then in regards to the draft EIR, is this the last piece that's needed to be completed before the draft EIR can be released?
The draft EIR is under preparation. This is the last sort of new information that needs to be known before the EIR can be finalized, though. The rest is all a matter of working with material that's already been prepared, technical work that's already been done. This is really new information that needs to be integrated into the document.
Okay. So if the council approves to do the draft term sheet and OID approves it, then this information would go into the draft EIR, and then the draft EIR would be released.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the last question is that in the number 14, when it talks about environmental review be completed prior to entering into any binding agreement regarding the transfer of water from OID to Brisbane and the obligation of Brisbane to pay for transfer of water. The agreement doesn't happen until the council deems that the EIR is complete. Now, we've also talked about that the project would go before the voters, and so how does that play into when that agreement would, once it was settled, would go into effect? So,
I got it. So, yes, to both of your points there, sir. We would not bring these agreements to you until an EIR had been certified. Because I think, quite frankly, for one reason, we wouldn't want to, because we don't know what a project is.
So
and a developer certainly wouldn't want to.
Too, so
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
We also have, the possibilities that it would go before the people to vote after it was certified. So, are we like after the vote?
After that, absolutely.
It would be okay.
Absolutely. Because the developer has to have a project. And I think that's really probably the biggest driver here. I mean, certainly we have our interest in making sure that we protect ourselves fiscally, but the developer is not going to want to sign a funding agreement if he doesn't have a project. He doesn't know what he can build.
Absolutely. Okay, good. I just want to make that clear to everybody out in the audience that, there is definitely a lot of process to happen and safeguards that we would all take, and also sharing with the community. Speaking of sharing with the community, I know there are some folks that would like to speak on this matter. So let's start from folks who sent in their slips first, and that would be Claire Johnson.
I have several questions. Should I just ask all the questions and then wait till the end?
Okay.
Is that what you like?
Yes, that would be fine.
I wondered when I looked at the staff report that it didn't have any reference to whether or not the city attorney reviewed it, and I was really happy to see that he was familiar with everything that was in it, and that was very helpful. I guess that's just a comment. And I wanted to ask about the cost after the processing and transport had been done by SFPUC, and I know that Randy answered that question, that we don't know. And I guess I'd like to know when we will know. Will we know before this becomes an agreement rather than a term framework? And there was a discussion that, it would be tripling our gallons per day if this were to go into effect the way it's written. And there'll be capital cost to that. I would imagine there would be more storage tanks and repair of those storage tanks, servicing those storage tanks, and I'd like to know what part of that is paid by the developer and what part of that just becomes part of the rates, because at some point I'm sure it would become part of the rates.
Infrastructure costs.
Yes, the infrastructure cost, both capital and maintenance. And the amount of water that was determined, this 2,000 acre feet for the Baylands, I guess that's based on the request of the developer. I just would like to clarify that. I raised clarifying it right now. Thank you. And the agreement that we're going to make with the developer for them to pay for all the water, I've been concerned about them getting behind on their payments on what's been going on so far with the EIR and also in the revolving fund. And I think that you need to, I guess this is a comment rather than a question, what kind of an agreement, a bond, is it going to be bonding for this? Will you ask them to pay in advance? And what about the probability that they're going to sell the development rights and sell either part or all of this development to someone else? So you'll be dealing with a successor, and that would mean that you better have an awfully good agreement, because you're going to be working with somebody else to try to collect.
Yeah, no, that's
and why wouldn't UPC be a signatory to the agreement that you're going to make, since they're referred to in it? And I guess I wanted to know if there was any legal reason that it would be a good idea for UPC to sign the agreement when it's actually completely written rather than the framework. Would there be a legal reason that we would want UPC to sign that agreement, since they're referred to in the body of it? I'm not sure. I'm asking. And I wondered about the competitive price for water. I know that, why should I worry if they're going to pay for it? But, I guess everyone always feels a little uneasy and about something that you're not sure that maybe you will be left holding the bag, and the possibility that they might go bankrupt, rather than just what happens then? Where do we stand in that? We already have an unpaid $146,000 related to the quarry that sits on that investment report every month. And I don't know how that would happen to us, but I'd like us to do anything we can to avoid that happening.
Absolutely.
And the fact that we pay that 100 acre per acre foot, that $100 is, I'm sure that there is a great market for the water and that it's competitive, but it seems like it's pretty much a lot of money for a reservation. And I just wanted to know what kind of research was done in making this agreement to see what other people have paid for reservations, or per acre feet, or what per acre foot. If we could, what was done to assure that that's the best deal we could get. And it really bothered me that you actually just talked about this, that there is no reference to your approval of the project. It was just explained why UPC would have, they would need that approval in order for them to sign agreements. But why isn't there any reference at all to whether or not this is approved by the City Council? And as you mentioned, since you have agreed to put it to a vote of the people, after your vote, whether or not you know, that isn't, nothing is mentioned. It's only mentioned about CEQA, and I understand that's probably because of the nature of this agreement. Nowhere in here does it say that you will make this agreement after the approval of the project. It says you'll make it after CEQA has been certified, not that the approval of the project. And the sorry, I'm just looking for any other comments that I might have. I appreciate that you've covered so many of the points that needed to be covered. I thank you for the opportunity to ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Clara. Randy, if you want to tackle just a couple of those questions that Clara.
Sure. Let me take a shot at these. So the first question was, when will the willing cost be known? Will it be before this term sheet morphs into an agreement? And the answer to that is yes. As I mentioned in my staff report, there are 3 agreements that are conditions precedent to us bringing a water transfer agreement back to you. So that cost has to be known with SFPUC. There was a question about capital costs. The term sheet and the ultimate project that we're talking about here really doesn't envision any capital costs. The system, the existing SFPUC system has certainly it's got a regular, reliable capacity of 265 million gallons a day, and it's gone well over 300 on multiple occasions. So there's no issue about putting a little paltry 2 MGD through there, and paltry, you know, the volume of the water always depends upon where you're looking at it. If you're the last of the small agencies that are members of BAUSCA, you know, we have 1 MGD, and, you know, 2 MGD looks like a lot to us, but there are people that have 17, 20, 26 unlimited amounts of water. So, and when you take that to a bigger system, it's not a big deal. The capital costs that will happen in the system are part of the environmental impact review that are going on, and those are requirements of the developer. They may be mitigations, they may be exactions, but certainly they have a backbone distribution system for water they have to put in. It's been identified a long time ago that there's a new reservoir that has to be put in, but those aren't related to this piece. This piece is related to bringing new water into the system, and that other question is really how do you distribute that locally once you get it. The 2,000 acre feet, yes, that amount was landed upon because it was the developer's request. That I believe they actually put a little fudge in there without really knowing what their project is. They see that as their highest maximum demand for potable water. Next point was a comment. I'll let Hal talk about whether UPC ought to sign the agreement or not between the city and Oakdale. Hal, if you want to comment on that, or.
I guess my initial reaction would be no, because before we sign that agreement, UPC will be signing their developer agreement with us. And so we would want to make sure that we're fully covered in terms of UPC's obligation before we make any commitments to Oakdale. They were not a part, I mean, the numbers may have come from UPC, but it was really the city staff that negotiated, and Randy in particular, that negotiated this agreement with OID, and that's exactly the way we wanted it. This was the city's arrangement, the city's contract. We have larger concerns, not only the Baylands, but also we wanted to make sure there was a water source assured for Sierra Point, and that it was available for the period of time that we wanted. So, well, UPC was certainly involved in the discussions. It was really the city that negotiated the term sheet. I suppose they could be a party to the final contract, but again, because the final contract is going to cover not only Sierra, the Baylands, but also Sierra Point, I think my initial reaction would be that we would want them committed before the city commits. We would want to know that the funding is available, and also very importantly to us that funding is secured in some manner. So we don't want to have a situation where we have to worry about a bankruptcy or the city not being able to collect from UPC or whoever the developer is. That is a contract which is not automatically assignable. And contracts of this kind can contain provisions that basically says that if there is a right to assign, a transfer has to be first approved by the city. so we can get into a careful analysis of who that transferee is going to be, what their experience and credit standing may be. I don't think we're in a position where we have to say that they can just transfer it off to some shell company that has no financial substance to it. So my expectancy would be that once a contract is executed with UPC, that the assignability of that agreement would also be controlled by the city and subject to approval by the city.
There were two other questions. One was the competitive price for water. Was there research done on it? Yes, there was research done on it. The reservation price is consistent with water that we're seeing coming from out of area. $100 an acre foot seems to be relatively straightforward. The pay price is actually less than the price that Modesto Irrigation District is presently negotiating with SFPUC. I'm going to lie if I tell you I remember the exact number. It's either $600 or $700 an acre foot, but it's more. $7? Thank you. So it's $700 an acre foot, so we are getting a better price on that. And then the last question was that the staff report really didn't have a reference to city's approval to your certification of the EIR and to your meeting your commitment to your constituents of putting the project to a vote before you approved a final funding agreement. And I suppose I just made an assumption that was apparent, that that's what the city council was going to do. City council would not take it upon themselves to enter into a binding agreement that would impose some financial future imposition on you without having a project approved, and that the city council would not be of a mind to ask staff to bring forward any of these agreements to you until you had satisfied your commitment to your constituency that you were going to put the project to a vote.
All right, thank you, Randy.
Sure.
All right, is there any follow-up from council regarding Claire's comments? You know, just quick question, Randy. Looking into the future, say that we have some development 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Does the city send a water bill to the property owner or the tenant of a building that might be built out on the Baylands? Would it be the same setup that we kind of see today, like Crocker Park, where you're sending out that bill?
I think that's a huge question we're going to have to answer in the developer funding agreement, sir. I will tell you that we've tossed that around a couple of times about how we set that up, but certainly first and foremost, we want to make sure the city's not on the hook for this, right? The only purpose in bringing this water in is for the developer. That's the only purpose this water has. Okay, that's all it does. And if that's something that wants to be done, or if there's any good assigned to it, right, wrong, or indifferent, but that is the only entity that it services. So I don't want to see my employer be on the hook for that, and I know the council doesn't want to be on the hook for that. So I am sure that Hal and I are going to spend many, many hours together in a small room talking about this and going through multiple scenarios and making sure that we nail that down to the best of our abilities.
Okay. All right, thanks. Okay, next, Michelle.
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident. Thank you for hearing all of our concerns and questions. I have a couple of questions, and my notes are a little bit all over the place. But I'll tell you one thing. You go through your life and you hear all these expressions, and you think, oh, that's interesting, and then one day you wake up and you go, oh, I understand that expression now. Wheeling and dealing. That's where it probably comes from, wheeling water. So, Randy, you said that none of the options they explored before this one were fruitful. And I would love to hear what you mean by that. Were they not economically feasible? Were they simply not available? What do you mean by not fruitful, and how long ago were those investigations done that were not fruitful? For example, desalinization. So I'm curious about that. And then our raw cost of water here that we're calculating, this is undelivered, is $1.15 per unit. What do we pay now for raw water? I know he said the delivered unit cost is $2.93 per unit delivered, but what's our raw cost of water undelivered? Okay, because that would give us some idea. And you know, I mean, I remember when gas was 18 cents a gallon and water was free. And that's not the way it is anymore. And there'll be a day when water costs more a gallon than gasoline. I don't know when that day will come.
Some places it already is.
Yeah, some places it already is, especially depending on how it's delivered. And so this is a serious issue we're facing in California and in the world. And, you know, this just seems like our little piece of it. But it really is important because, I mean, when we talked about the way the water goes from, you know, Oakdale Irrigation District to the Modesto place to San Pedro Reservoir to the, you know, the system that now supplies us water from Hetch Hetchy. And now is this other water going to be using the same pipes? Will our fabulous Hetch Hetchy water now taste different? I mean, it sounds like it's all just water, but I read this horrifying article recently about Eagle Lake, which is like the mother place for the most amazing trout in the world that supply all the trout farms and everything like that. And the drawdown on Eagle Lake is destroying it. And everybody's like, well, you know, but we have the right to the water that goes into it, and we have well water for new developments, and all of a sudden Eagle Lake is incredibly imperiled this year and will probably cease to produce the amount of trout that it does. And so when we talk about they have so much water that what we're asking for is nothing more than what evaporates for them in a day, well, what's going to happen in 20 years from now or 30 years from now with all this situation with global warming? So those are just other things we need to think about. But the things that I have questions now that we can answer, or maybe not, will this water mix with our current water supply, and how will that affect the water quality that we enjoy right now, which is actually probably some of the highest in the West Coast. Our water is certainly better tasting than Marin, better tasting than anywhere else down the peninsula. We get it first out of the pipe from Hetch Hetchy, and we're very privileged. And I feel our water taste quality went down when we switched systems from chlorine to chloramamine, and I wonder how much further it will degrade when we're drinking treated irrigation water. And then you say we have the right to sell it, but who would we sell it to? That's a concern. And then I was kind of concerned because this is a precondition to complete the EIR for us, for the Baylands development. But then what if this EIR moves forward, but then their CEQA EIR for this agreement doesn't move forward? So then what happens? It's kind of catch-22, the chicken or the egg. Our EIR moves forward, our development agreements move, you know, but then they still have to do an EIR on this according to the document I read, because they haven't done their CEQA on this water transfer thing. Is that just a done deal, or does CEQA not mean anything anymore? So I have questions about that. And then, you know, again, the question about using San Francisco public utility system currently to deliver the water, and where's the water really coming from? Because is it possibly tainted with insecticides because it comes from some reservoir that isn't the reservoir that we're using now? It's off in some agricultural area. That these undetectable things that or at low levels that shouldn't harm people. I'm concerned about that. And then I'm concerned about if the developer walks away, then what? What if there's world strife and suddenly all the funding that supports the developer offshore disappears and they just say, well, screw it, we're leaving, and they're gone? Then what happens? Because then we really will be holding the bag because there's no entity there with, you know, skin in the game, so to speak, other than a toxic landfill. So I'm worried about that. And I know some of these things sound extreme, but if we don't look at the extremes and we just look at the rosy picture, then we're not prepared. And then when we talk about, you were doing the math about, you know, $240,000 obligation just for the water reservation for 5 years, plus the $1.2 million a year after the 5 years. But when you read the document, I think, if my math is correct, 20% of that is for Sierra Point, possibly, and not an obligation to the UPC's Baylands development. It might be UPC's Sierra Point development, but not UPC's Baylands development. So that means that we would be responsible, if my math is correct, for $48,000 a year beginning at the beginning of this agreement for the first 5 years, whether anybody at Sierra Point used it or not, and then $240,000 a year for every year after that. Now, I'm sure we all kind of are thinking that somebody's going to finally develop something at Sierra Point, but we've been waiting 30 years already. So are we going to pay $240,000 a year for another 30 years till that gets developed? Because that's our responsibility, not the Baylands Development Agreement responsibility. So I just want to point that out, that they're not going to pay for everything, because we are making commitments here as well. And then I have to ask, how much is the cost of money? Because I've worked in industries where cash is king, and in this case where, you know, we're supplying the money that we then get paid for sometime later, what's the cost of that money? I know that if I wanted to borrow $900,000, the cost of that money to me personally would probably be, 20%. If I was an entity like the City of Brisbane, it might be 5% or 3% or 2%. So what's the cost of money? It's not zero any way it goes. Some banks live on float alone. So that's a concern when we talk about a obligation being in arrears to the City of Brisbane. And then there's, you said, Cliff, that there's a lot of process to happen, including an election, before we really can move forward on what our development agreement would be. And that's a really big question mark, because what exactly would the people of Brisbane be voting on? Housing or no housing, or this development? Yes or no? And so I have concerns and questions there, because you make it sound like it's a done deal that we will have an election. Well, we will need to have an election if housing is part of any kind of agreement out there, because we've already voted not to have housing. So that's a big, big question mark in my mind. And so it's really a case of chicken and egg with this, and I have really grave concerns. Our fathers, not our founding fathers, but our fathers, Clark, acquired that property for Brisbane when we became a city to help us be solvent in the future and be, for part of Brisbane. And it's always been a contentious thing, a double-edged sword for us. And I would hate to see this imperil our existence as a City of Brisbane. I really would. And this it concerns me at that level. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. You want to ask that question? You want to ask it?
Yeah.
Don't you ask it?
It's okay.
All right.
You can ask him.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Randy. So, you want to tackle some of the concerns that were raised?
Nothing would please me more, sir.
Thank you.
So let me see if I captured the question. So there was first one was, what did I mean by the early options not being fruitful? And what I meant by the earlier options not being fruitful was that none of the options explored individually or in sum would have met the estimated supply demand. And in a number of the cases, the people approached were just unwilling customers. Even if they had excess water available, they didn't want to part with it at the time. It varies. No, we did not consider desalination. No, we did not. So the question was, what do we pay for undelivered raw water now? We don't have that water rate. The only water rate option we have is to get potable water that meets current water quality standards from SFPUC. There isn't a reservation fee with SFPUC.
What is the rate between now to units delivered or not delivered to the house?
$293 per cubic. $293 per unit. Mr. Mayor, do you want us to engage in this fashion? How do you want me to continue here?
Randy, you asked the question. No, I know, but you know what? Maybe later on we'll come back to it, but just for process, so we can keep things clean. Let Randy respond to the questions that you asked at the podium, please.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question?
since we have a lot of other people, is it best to take all the questions?
You know, I only have one more. I only have one more slip, so.
I see there are people.
Okay, we did get another one here, but you know, I think the questions that are being asked are different than what was asked prior, and I think we're getting a lot of good feedback from the community, and I think we need to keep the process moving along the way that it's going. So, Randy?
Sure. So there was a question about the quality of the water. It is the exact same water that we presently get. The water we presently get comes out of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. The water that we will get will come out of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir.
Same water. Okay.
Same exact water. There was a question about OID's future water needs. It's always nice that we can be generous and look at other people, but I mean, certainly that's OID's responsibility, I think, to look at what their future needs are going to be. OID has already indicated that they are a willing seller of this water. OID has told us that they previously have sold 41,000 acre-feet a year. They've got all indications that they want to sell us this water, so I'm presuming that they've made that determination for themselves, that they are not, just as I try to do for you and give you my recommendations, they are not short-sighting their customers in future.
And you know, sir, we just, you know, we're trying to do the meeting and you know, the proper protocol. You're going to be coming up next, so you can ask that question. But Randy, I just want to make it just crystal clear that even though we're dealing with the Oakdale Irrigation District, none of the water is treated irrigation water.
That is correct. It is all Hetch Hetchy water.
It's all Hetch Hetchy.
It is all Hetch Hetchy water.
And when the water is coming down the mountain, it's in the Tuolumne River. It's the same water that's going to San Francisco once it is treated.
So, would you like me to give you some detail on how it works? A little more detail, because it's really complex, and I can.
We should, you know, just so that we have a clear understanding that this water is not being, you know, taken from, you know, a source that would give concern or suspicion. So.
Understood. Sure, understood. So let me try and draw a word picture here. So there are two watersheds we're talking about right now. There's the Tuolumne River watershed and the Stanislaus River watershed. The Tuolumne River watershed is the shed on which Hetch Hetchy is built. That's where Hetch Hetchy Reservoir with O'Shaughnessy Dam is. Coming out of the O'Shaughnessy Dam, there are two ways water can leave there. There's an overflow point where water is allowed to go directly into the Tuolumne River downstream of the dam, and there's a hard pipe system.
Okay.
The hard pipe system is what goes to SFPUC. The water that's allowed to run down the river is what goes into New Don Pedro Reservoir. So New Don Pedro Reservoir was built by the Modesto Irrigation District and the Turlock Irrigation District. A number of years ago, when they expanded the capacity of it, SFPUC, I don't know who approached who, but SFPUC became part of that arrangement and said, could we get a water bank in there? Could we find a way to store some water in there? And they do, so they paid for that cost. Now, in the Stanislaus watershed off the Stanislaus River, you have Oakdale Irrigation District. Oakdale Irrigation District has very senior water rights. I don't know what the nature of all their contracts are, but I've read through their documents. I've seen how much excess water they say they have and how much they've certified. They are an irrigation district. Now they have systems, their canals, that will connect directly to the Modesto Irrigation District's canals, not to the reservoir, to their canals. So Oakdale can take its irrigation water, put it into Modesto's irrigation district, and deliver it nearly directly, except by part of that transfer, to Modesto's irrigation customers. So what that does is, instead of having to release Tuolumne River water that's come down the river and into New Don Pedro, and having to release that into MID's system for irrigation, they now have an excess amount of water in there. Because the amount of flow that comes out down Tuolumne is specified. I don't remember which laws or exactly which agreements, but MID and TID have senior rights to the water. SFPUC have junior rights to the water. They actually do an accounting of the inflow and the outflow of it every day between those three agencies. So now you've got this excess amount of water in Don Pedro. So part of this deal, what it says then is that on paper, because it's MID excess water, right? Because they've already taken care of their downstream customers, their irrigation customers, with Oakdale irrigation water. Now, MID can transfer this water to SFPUC in Don Pedro. So the water hasn't moved. It's just moved which paper it's on. It sits over there. The way SFPUC takes water out of the Hetch Hetchy is that during the high flow seasons, when there's enough water in the river to satisfy Modesto senior needs, to satisfy TID senior needs, and to satisfy the demands of the river that typically it's been, that's been mandated, that's been regulated to satisfy the fish population, the flora and the fauna. When there's excess water in there, they then take water out of Hetch Hetchy directly into that hard pipe system that I talked about earlier, and they hard pipe it all the way into San Francisco. So the water that we're going to get is not going to be water stored from Don Pedro. It's not going to be irrigation water. It's going to be water directly out of Hetch Hetchy. Because when they'll take that water, and then on paper, they'll debit the bank account that they have in New Don Pedro so they can deliver it. So the water you're going to get is the same water you've been getting.
All right, and thank you for clarifying that, and that was an excellent description of how this water will get to us. So thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. I tried to draw a picture of it, but it's much easier to describe in words. There's way too many complications.
No, and I have to say it's also very impressive, how much, knowledge you have of this subject matter, and how much you care about it, and how much you want to convey that, that information to the public.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
So I'll try to continue with this. Will it mix with existing? Yes. Who would we sell it to? It's an open market. The term sheet that we have set up here envisions that we would, if anywhere, sell it within the regional water system, within SFPUC's regional water system, so it would only be to existing BAUSCA customers. We're not thinking about moving it anywhere. I mean, that's a fallback option. It's an option of, when we have years where the developer's not using it, could we sell it? Could we maybe make a little money on it? Could we maybe clip a coupon because we facilitated giving water to somebody over a short term? The OID secret review, yes, they're responsible for doing the secret review within their system. And as I've indicated, they've previously done a review that allowed them to transfer 41,000 acre-feet. I'm not 100% privy if they have to do an update or not, but again, they're going to be the lead within their system. There was a question about what if the developer walks away, and I think that ties in very directly with the conversation we've had about the developer funding agreement and what type of surety do we really get. In the conversation that I had, that Hal and I are going to spend a lot. I keep saying Hal, although Hal's maybe getting out of here before. Now he's laughing at me because it's going to be Randy and some unknown person in the future that's going to be trying to figure this out and make sure that we have some privity. And really, I mean, we've tossed around terms, like something equivalent to a payment bond, something that allows you to access money if you need it. If you've got a developer that hasn't paid or is thinking about walking away. The 400 acre-feet is not the responsibility of UPC, absolutely. Michelle must have absolutely caught that. I hit it on page 2 of the staff report, but she's very correct. That 400 acre-feet is targeted for people out at Sierra Point. I think the city will have to very quickly make decisions and contacts with those developers as we're in the process of putting these precedent agreements into place and fine-tuning those. We're going to have to talk to those developers and say, hey, look, you either are or you aren't, because if you're not part of this, we're going to take that amount out. That's really us. In many ways, that's the city reaching out, being forward-thinking and saying, we see how hard it is for anybody to get water. We've got a deal here where we happen to have a developer who spent a lot of time studying all these options, said, why don't we take care of potential other businesses in the city of Brisbane now if they want to take it. So that's why we did that. The cost of money for arrears, I think, I'll leave that to Stu if Stu wants to answer that later. And then there was a conversation that Michelle had with the mayor about the election and the timing. And
no, you don't have to
you
deal
can
with
answer
that one.
Sir.
But Randy, there is one thing that's in your staff report that we haven't talked about. And
name it, sir. There's got to.
It's it's the first page of the term sheet, number 2, which is term, and the third sentence, I believe. Brisbane may terminate the agreement on 2 years prior notice at any time after 5 years from the effective date. So after that 5-year period, we're going to the 6-year period, and we feel like, okay, we got this somewhat dialed in. We think we're going to need X amount of water, and then 10 years goes by, and we feel like, you know what, this isn't working out, and we get the 2-year notice, and we're no longer obligated to buy that water.
Yes, sir. That's referred to as the off-ramp clause.
The off-ramp clause. Okay, so we haven't talked about the off-ramp clause, but there is an off-ramp. Well, there would be an off-ramp clause, and it would look something like this. One of the things, Hal, if you could just talk about it. I mean, it keeps coming up, and about some kind of a funding agreement. What would that kind of look like? Is it something you'd use a bond or?
It certainly should be secured in some fashion, whether we're talking about a bond or some security interest in the property or a combination of that. I think it is important to keep in mind, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's really a critical component of this thing, the off-ramp. We're not on the hook for 50 years, we're on the hook for 2 years, basically, because we can always give notice and terminate the agreement.
After the first 5 years.
Right. But it's during that time when, theoretically you wouldn't commit to anything other than the reservation. So you're on the hook for the reservation, and the developer certainly is. And then at most after that, you're on the hook for a 2-year if you decide to give notice. That has the benefit then of quantifying to a large degree the financial exposure of the city if the developer was to go south or go bankrupt or whatever. That financial obligation could be secured by a bond or letter of credit or deed of trust on the property or all of the above. So that is a conversation that we'll have to have, and I don't think the staff would be comfortable coming back to the council with any kind of an agreement without being able to give you and the city the assurance that if there was a problem with the project, the city would have some form of collateral to fall back on that would cover the extent of the financial exposure that would be there under the agreement. And I think that off-ramp really serves a vital function of defining what the extent of that financial exposure might be. Because at that point, our cost is going to be fixed on the water. But I think also it gives us 2 years then to, explore other sources. I think the one thing we all know is that the water supply is not going to suddenly increase. Everybody around here relies on Hetch Hetchy to a large degree, and they've got some improvements to make, but essentially they're pretty much out of water for new development. So there may be opportunities to resell. We made it a point to make it clear that the city had the right to resell anywhere within the regional area, not just within the city or adjacent cities. So that water can be transported in the same way we're getting the water under this agreement. It doesn't mean we have to have a physical pipe to another jurisdiction. Brisbane might become the wheeling agency, and through SFPUC that has a pipe connections work out some arrangement where that water is redirected from Brisbane to another agency, and there's some arrangement between the three. So any number of options are available, but I think all of those alternatives would be looked at before we come back to you with some kind of an agreement.
All right. Thank you, Hal, for that clarification. All right. So now we're going to move on to Michael. He's next. He's after this. Michael Warburton. Sorry about that.
I'm executive director of a group called the Public Trust Alliance, which is a nonprofit that looks at issues of public trust, and water is certainly one of those. That water is held in trust. It's not like other property. I mean, you probably wouldn't know that from the discussion that's happened here about buying and selling water, but it's not quite the same as that kind of property. And there are more water rights in California than there is water. In the CalFed negotiations, they came up with 8 times as many water rights as there was actual water. And one question that Brisbane might want to think about is how many people and how many times is the same water being sold or negotiated within the next 5 years that you're talking about. California is the same water. There's all kinds of senior rights and things like this, but when things started out, the entire flow of rivers is over appropriated right now, and in some cases it's a matter. These people with excess water, that whole concept of excess water, the question about climate change is a very, very important one. You're talking about a contract for 45 years, and precipitation is going to change, both in its timing and its quantity, whether there's snowpack or whether it comes down in flood. There's a lot of changes in the water system, and I think some of the concerns raised by people in the community about, wait a second, what are you talking about, and what's the bag and who's holding it, are very, very important. And water is over appropriated, and I don't think there's one thing that there was a term in the terms that the water that would be transferred would not be subject to the jurisdiction of the State Water Resources Control Board. Well, the State Water Resources Control Board is the trustee for the people of California for the waters of the state of California. And I was just wondering, who's responsible for guaranteeing that that water is not subject to the jurisdiction of the State Water Resources Control Board? And, and I think the other...
Thank you, Michael. All right, so sounds like Michael's issue is the math.
Is your microphone on, Randy?
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, no, I agree with Mr. Warburton. Modern water that's being transferred, and when I say modern, I mean water that doesn't have rights established to it right now, is a public trust, and it is monitored by the SWRCB. The water that OID is transferring is pre-1914 water that had its rights established then, so it's not subject to the SWRCB overview. And that's a statement that OID is making to us in there. I don't know what point he's trying to make by suggesting that in many places the volume of different rivers is over-allocated. The flow in the Tuolumne is mandated. In fact, much of the mandates come from the licensing of the hydroelectric power plants that are on there. In fact, it's coming up again in 2016. There's a relicensing that goes in, and there's mandatory flows that have to go in again, as I mentioned earlier, for the flora and the fauna. So I suppose it's possible. I don't have the data he has that he's looking at. It's possible that the water's over-allocated in some sense, but there's also a minimum flow that has to be kept in the river. So I'm not sure how those two points tie together. And then his last point, I believe, was a question regarding just the nature of the contract time and how there is much uncertainty as you move forward in the years, and you're absolutely right. But on the other hand to that, the other part of that equation is, while you're thinking that there's going to be these other changes, things are going to happen in the environment, if you approve a development now that has a water demand, it's not going to go away in 45 years. It's going to be around for that long, and you're going to need to have water for it. And if you're not going to be able to get your water extensions, you're going to have to find other water sources for it. So it's a never-ending situation. I've actually had this conversation with the folks out at the irrigation districts, because they tend to have a different philosophy on it, because they will look at their water from a term of the lifetime of a crop. So say you put in something like almond trees, and maybe an almond tree crop has a 15 to 25-year life. So when you're negotiating for that, that's what you need water for. You need water for 15 to 25 years, because you know at the end of that time they're going to be past their useful production. Developments don't have that. They don't die. They don't stop needing water. Once they're in place, they're in place. There are people that are coming to work. There are businesses that are existing. They still need water. So that's why we're trying to get, why staff is recommending the longest water terms that you can possibly get. And I think those were all the questions.
Okay, thanks. All right, John?
Clean sheet.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. My name is John Christopher Burr. I'm proud to be a lifelong resident of Brisbane. And as many of you know, I am licensed to practice law before the California Supreme Court, all the courts in the state, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. Not every lawyer can say that. As I heard both our city attorney and our city engineer refer to this as a contract, and but then there was some statement that it's non-binding. Now,
He clarified that it was a mistake.
Pardon me?
It's a term sheet. That's what.
Term sheet, right.
Yeah.
But it also says transfer agreement in capitals, right? And so, if it's supposed to be non-binding, I think that you should add that in bold letters right at the front. Non-binding and legally unenforceable. Also, if it's supposed to be non-binding and legally unenforceable, you should add that under the place where it says terms, and also at the end where the parties say that they agree to the foregoing terms. That's at the very end, in agreements of the parties here too. So you should say it at least 3 times. This is non-binding and legally unenforceable. And make that very clear, because, you know, if you don't make it clear, the court's not going to supply it for you, although they do have some gap-filling measures. Now, what does it take? I was taught contract law by a fellow who is now sitting on the California Court of Appeals, and he's often referred to as a brilliant guy. And they taught me in school that to make a contract, all you need is what's known as the essential terms. You don't have to have every term spelled out. And this is how business is done all the time. You know, just a telegram can end up being a contract, so an enforceable contract. And I've seen contracts in lots of cases that have a lot less verbiage in them than this one that were enforced. Now, what is it that a contract protects? Well, it protects the party's expectation interest. Okay, this is what the lawyers say. And so that's how you calculate the damages. And here, in this contract, it talks about the parties expect this contract to last 25 to 50 years. So what you're really looking at is something in the neighborhood of $150 million, maybe, up to, and possibly, if I would say this was a very onerous and one-sided contract with very little protection for the city of Brisbane. For example, it says that Brisbane can cancel after 7 years, which means payments may be up in the neighborhood of $21 million. Okay, that's how I read it. Now, maybe reasonable minds can differ. And if it were really spelled out clearly, that wouldn't be the case. This is how lawsuits start. Now, there is a provision in here that talks about what happens if there's a dispute. Well, what you do is, before you file a lawsuit, you go into mediation to talk about your rights and obligations. That's in section 19 right here. That sounds like an enforceable contract to me. Or it's the first step to an enforceable contract. The question is should Brisbane really be entering into this water wheeling kind of agreement with that is reminiscent of what Enron was doing before they went bankrupt? Should we really be gambling with the public's with our resources, the city's resources? We're a small community. We don't have that kind of a budget to be playing around with $150 million deals, okay? What should you do here? Well, make context, put $150 million on the table before you enter into something like this. Don't ask us to be party to this kind of a deal, because we already pay some of the highest water rates in this country. And I'm speaking for the senior citizens here on fixed incomes. I don't think they'd like to have their rates raised anymore to end up subsidizing Tuntex or for some mistake that somebody made in negotiating this deal. Now, and I would also hope that Hal has malpractice insurance in the neighborhood of $21 million to $150 million, just in case. And I would make sure that that was in place before I ever signed something like this. But if you don't believe me that this might cause you some trouble, you can certainly run it by lots of other lawyers and law professors. They're available. Get a written opinion. Get several of them. 2, 3, 4, 5 written opinions from other independent lawyers. And then you'll see. I think what you'll find is you'll be very surprised at what this little deal could lead to here. Expectations, it talks about it. So, you know, I don't think we should enter into this. This is a bad deal. It has very little protection. And to me, it looks like it was thrown together by it's worse than something a first-year law student would put together, in my opinion, because it's sloppy. It has terms that are vague and can be interpreted several different ways. But here, I'll just give you an example. I threw in a laundry list here of the things that they were going to put in later, like force majeure. That's basically act of God. If something happens, some terrible accident happens, gee, we can get out of the contract. You know, third-party beneficiaries, that's all contract stuff right there. But what I don't see is what's known as the most favored nations clause. And what is that? Well, that says you can't give a better deal to anybody else. You can't sell it for any less than someone else. You have to give us the best deal around. That's not in here. That's a standard provision in any kind of contract. All the contracts I used to do with the government, you know, are way better than this. You know, way more one-sided to benefit the city. This isn't one of those kinds of contracts. One of my good friends was a chief counsel at the Federal Reserve Bank. He used to like to say he'd give people thick contracts like this, and he'd say as soon as they signed it, they're in breach. Okay? This isn't one of those kind of contracts. Very little protection for the city of Brisbane, no protection for the citizens. You know, this is really not a good deal, and you could do far better. Now, what else could you do? You could say in tongue text, do your own water company. Okay? Or you can use the provisions of the Subdivision Map Act to say, you pay for everything. Don't involve us. Don't put us on the line for this. This is not good business. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Oh, one last point. One last point. As I see it, too, this is inconsistent with the Brisbane's general plan, our law. Right now, as it is, it seems really odd to me that you're processing an application for housing on a toxic waste dump when our general plan says that's illegal. But here, you know, everybody wants to ignore the toxins and pretend that there's not cancer-causing material out there that'll be there forever, according to Dr. G. Fred Lee. And I suggest everybody go to his website and read his reports. GFredLee.com, I think it's called. And he wrote an extensive report and shows how weak the regulations are out here, too.
That was the last one.
But this is inconsistent with our current general plan. Our general plan, the conservation element deals with our water supply. This is nowhere in there. The circulation element deals with the backbone, the infrastructure of the town. There's nothing about this kind of stuff in there. Okay? And the safety element also deals with issues of fire hazards and things like that. So that's our water supply. Nothing in the safety element about this kind of a deal. This is an extra added burden. It's inconsistent with our general plan. I think you got a legal problem here. And this is a problem, you know, if you guys would have read the guidelines from the Office of Planning and Research, the general plan guidelines, they would have told you, don't try to do too much at once. Don't try to do a specific plan and a general plan update at the same time, because you create problems for yourselves. And that's exactly what you've done. You've gone way over the edge, taken on way too much shit, been talking to this crazy fancy trip of building housing and other things out on the toxic waste dump that'll always be toxic and hazardous.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Okay. Is there anybody else in the audience? Barbara?
Greetings, everyone. I seem to have a chronic problem with getting my slips in, but I'm here.
Get her name. Can we get your name, Barbara?
Barbara Ebel. I'm not as worried about this as I have been. about some other things that have come before the council. I do think the city needs to address this in some way, water needs out there, because even if we do something as minimal as bioremediation, even that's going to take water, right? So I can understand why the city's involved in this. But I got to tell you, if I was looking at this as a contract I personally was thinking about entering, and I'd be giving it the stink eye, because it's kind of... and I know it's not a contract, but even as a preliminary, it just seems kind of wishy-washy to me. Because in a lot of places it says, the city of Brisbane shall pay. Well, you know, I'm not a lawyer. John's the lawyer. But, you know, even if I was looking at this, I'd say the city of Brisbane shall pay on behalf of UPC, who will then reproduce. You know, I wouldn't leave any ambiguity in here anyway about where this money is going to be coming from. Because the reason OID is insisting that Brisbane be named in this contract is because the city of Brisbane can't go anywhere. We are physically connected to this location. A corporation can get up and leave and go overseas, and you can scream and shout, and they can just go, you know, make me pay, try, you know. Not that I think that anybody, I'm not trying to, you know, cast aspersions on anybody's character here, but that's just a fact of it, that, you know, corporations are mobile, and they can walk away from things, and a city can't. So I think that we need to be much more you know, I'd like to see this document be much more careful, even if it is just a term sheet and not a binding contract. It's still kind of, like I said, it's giving me the heebie-jeebies, just because it just says, you know, things like Brisbane shall pay, and like I said, that's because OID wants us to be on the hook penultimately. You know, and we have to be very careful about that. And then I just had a couple of specific little points I want to picked up. Number 6, the increase shall be no less than 2% annually. Now, I thought that was kind of steep considering we're in a recession. That kind of seems like a high bottom line to me. I don't know if that's something OID is insisting on or not. And then number 8, it specifies that the Modesto fees will be paid by OID, but it doesn't specify who will be paying the CCSF fees. It looks like Brisbane, yeah. That's kind of what I thought, like I wasn't entirely sure. And then number 10, it says OID will not warranty the quality or fitness of water, the transfer water. Now, I know we're getting out from Hetch Hetchy, but I just made me wonder if somewhere down the line, someone else in this circle of pats on the back, if they're not going to be upset by that. Like, I don't know if that's just something to be looked at. Because it just, I don't know, when anybody says that I have no responsibility for the quality of my performance of this contract, you know, my end of this deal, it kind of makes you go, well, what maybe are they trying to get away with there? You know, it's just something that gets me, it's just kind of one of those scary clauses. And, you know, and it's, the water supply, water may not be available, and, you know, I don't know. What does that do to UPC if suddenly they just decide they don't have the water to spare? Those are things that have to be worked out in the contract, obviously not in the term sheet. And I think that's basically all I wanted to say, is just that I just, you know, even as a term sheet, I'd really like to see this tightened up. Although I do, you know, fully agree that the council needs to do something, maybe. You know, I don't know, can UPC buy water directly? Or is it required that municipalities buy water? I'm not sure. you know, people can turn their, even if a corporation isn't a shell right now, it can be turned into a shell, you know, like PG&E did, and I was actually thinking of Enron also. They took and they moved the money elsewhere, and it was, somebody was left holding an empty bag that wasn't empty when the deal was originally negotiated. So, okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Randy, you want to tackle a couple of the points that Barbara raised?
Sure, let me take a shot at a couple of those. The first comment that I'm going to try and answer was the question about the CPI increase and whether 2% was a reasonable number. That's the same number we use. That's the CPI increase we use in all of the agreements that we place into. So I guess if we think we're being reasonable, then the answer is yes, it's reasonable. There was a concern about OID not warranting the quality or fitness of the water. So remember what this is. This is a fact sheet between Brisbane and OID. But OID is not delivering the water to us. They're making water available basically in Hetch Hetchy for SFPUC to deliver to us. So I can understand why they wouldn't want to be responsible for warranting quality or fitness of use of water that they have no control over. They don't touch it, they don't see it, they don't treat it, they don't pump it, they don't do anything with it. So I can understand why they would not want to be responsible there.
So Randy, we would have a separate agreement with SF.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sure. Well, actually, the fitness of use of that water falls under our existing agreement with SFPUC.
Okay.
And then I think there may have, if I wasn't sure what paragraph, but I thought I heard Barbara say that there was a comment about water will not be available, and what I'm reading in paragraph 11, it says water transfer to Brisbane will not be reduced on an annual basis by OID for any reason.
Okay, maybe.
Unless by mutual agreement. So I think that's what that's talking about. And then I think her questions about whether UPC can buy water directly, I'll refer to Hal.
Yes.
And I can't comment on the fact sheet giving you the heebie-jeebies. I'm sorry, Barbara.
Okay.
We each have our own level of heebie-jeebiness.
Hal, do you want to respond to that?
I think basically we wanted to control our own water supply. We had other uses for it. Whether they could contract directly, I would defer to the developer on that. But it was structured this way from the beginning, only because it's the city that provides the water, and we want to maintain control over the water. And if there's a surplus, and if we have an opportunity to sell it elsewhere, we want to reserve that right as well. I think we felt we were losing some control over our own services by having it all turned over to the developer.
Anybody? Oh, Clark.
Before you can, actually, Hal, I'd like you to answer to the some of the legal things that John had brought up, because
I'll be happy to.
I think those need to be addressed. You know, about this being basically a term sheet, and that I guess his point about writing on there that not legally binding 3 times or what?
John seems to be, without imputing his legal analysis, I'd have to say I disagree with just about every word of it, but John seems to be a fan of redundancy, that it's not legally binding, and while he was talking, I think he mentioned it ought to be inserted in 3 places. Actually, I found it already there in 7 places. So I don't know how often you want to say the same thing, but if you look first on page 1, second from the bottom paragraph says it's not binding. The next page 2, 2 places there. The second paragraph and the 4th paragraph and the whereas says again it's not legally binding in section 14, first paragraph, section 14, second paragraph, again section 20, second paragraph, and then on the top of page 7 it says so again. So the point is that John kept referring to this as a contract. I don't think you'll find the word contract in here anywhere except in language that says it's not a contractual obligation. This has not been referred to as a contract. Both speakers talked about terms that were missing. In some respects, that's deliberate. when you do a term sheet that's only intended as kind of an outline but not intended to be legally binding, one of the legal mechanisms you use to illustrate that fact, and that's reflected in paragraph 17, is you list out a whole bunch of what are normally regarded as important terms of a contract that have to be addressed in a future agreement. Section 17 is really an illustration of the fact that this is not intended to be a complete agreement. There are a lot of important terms that are to be added later, that it's not binding for that reason among others, among all the multiple recitals in here that it is not. So I don't know how many times you can repeat saying the same thing. You could put it in the title in capital bolded letters if you like, but it says it repeatedly. I found real quickly 7 places in the agreement it says it's not binding, and at some point you get into overkill, and I don't know how many times you have to say the same thing, but I think it's pretty clear from this document it was not intended as a contract.
Thank you, Hal. Okay.
Wait a minute. There's still a couple other questions.
Oh, okay,
I think a real important one about it not being consistent with our own general plan, and I'm assuming he's talking about our current general plan, so...
But I get back to the point that this contract does not dictate the land use. As John was talking about housing in the baylands, or the term sheet. This doesn't really deal with the city's land use or the general plan. All OID is concerned about is showing it has water available, and it is not attempting to regulate how the city approves the land uses in the baylands beyond the passing reference that, you know, it was a brownfield development. I don't think they'll have any objection to taking out mixed use because they really don't care.
Mm-hmm. And there's a thing in there talking about over the life of it, if it went to as it is, it'd cost up to $150 million.
Well, I'm not going to call my malpractice carrier and check my coverage because I don't think
not towards you. I mean,
I'm happy to show this to any other lawyer if you want to have another one take a look at it to determine whether it's binding or not. But the fact of the matter is, as we talked about earlier, there is a defined outer limit of exposure. Initially, we do have the 5-year period, and after that, we've got the exit ramp with a 2-year period. So we're not looking at hundreds of millions of dollars here. We're looking at the exposure initially for 5 years, and then after that, at any 2-year period, we can bail out. And that can be quantified, and I think that can be secured.
That's right. And it's 5 years at $100.
Yes.
And then you could do a bond that then would cover that amount. So.
And that 5 years is for the reservation. If we're going to the higher price, that means we're actually using the water when it gets up to the 500 level.
That's right.
And the reservation is nothing unusual. We do that ourselves when we charge people a fixed amount for their sewer service. We're giving them the availability of the service, whether they use it or not. So there's nothing particularly unique about that aspect of the agreement. You're paying for the capacity, not for the actual service.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, good. Carolyn, did you want to speak on this matter? Okay.
I've been listening to this and also have been reading through this agreement. I feel that if the city is going to be signing off on this, that we should also put in something that if this development does not move forward and looks as though it does not move forward, that the city has the right to use the water in a different capacity or to sell the water. I think it's really important to put that in. I think that's all.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. The water transfer section, does that take care of that, Randy?
I would suggest that that's already in there, sir, yes. So we have the right to use the water anywhere, to transfer it anywhere within the regional water system or use it within our city.
All right. And then we also have that effective date, too, when we would start to purchase the water, that it is, you know, you can just explain that
I'm sorry, sir. I'm not sure I heard the whole question. There's distractions from the audience.
Sorry. The effective date, that is the date that water would start to, that's the date the water would start to flow.
So the date of the water transfer agreement is the date when we would have that water available to take if we so chose, and we would have 5 years from signing that.
And everything would be in place, approved project, everything is done before. This would actually be one of the last things that we would probably finalize.
Most likely, sir.
Okay. I know, but I got to ask someone else who hasn't spoke. Mike?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. My name is Michael Barnes. I'm a Brisbane resident. Today, people are concerned about climate change and Baylands development. No one knows what the future holds. This has always been true. The best we can do is plan the best we can. This term sheet helps us plan for the future of the Baylands. Concern about, I've heard people tonight express concern about the price of water. Maybe they think it's too expensive, but on the other hand, they're saying that water is becoming more precious. So I think there is a contradiction there in their concerns. I've also heard concerns that this water agreement may imperil Brisbane. But Brisbane is already facing its own fiscal crisis. I don't think a developer bankruptcy or this water agreement is going to present any problem to Brisbane, because I have trust in Hal Topple as your city attorney. I worked with Hal Topple for 14 years, 6 on the Planning Commission and 8 on the City Council, and he did great work protecting the city. I know that if you apply yourselves to the term sheet and the contracts that Hal brings to you, the city will be adequately protected. I urge you to approve the term sheet. Thank you.
Anybody else in the audience? Michelle?
I just wanted to clarify one point is that according to number 13, Brisbane will be paying for OID's environmental impact report on this water. And I had heard the opposite of that, so I just wanted to make sure it was really clear.
Yeah, I think the agreement is with Brisbane, but that UPC then will pay Brisbane for that.
Make sure that's really...
Yeah, no, it would be in the developer funding agreement.
So, and again, sir, refer back to paragraph 9 is what I would suggest. Paragraph 9 on page 4.
We got it. That's good. Barbara, you wanted to make that one comment?
I don't remember who on staff, Barbara Ebel, I don't remember who on staff said that this water this is protecting a resource and this water will not be taking away, but I've got to take issue with that statement. I don't know who it was, I don't care. Because the water, there's a limited amount of water in the environment. Now, whether it's needed whether we're taking it somewhere from where it's needed or not, I don't know, that's not really important. Also, I didn't see anywhere in this term sheet a slice of pie for the city of Brisbane. And I thought that should be included in here somewhere, because the city, no matter how well this contract is done, the eventual contract is done, there's a certain amount of risk for the city of Brisbane. You can't ever completely avoid risk. And I think risk implies compensation. And also, if we're tripling our water service, the water service that's coming, that we're administering, I know it's going to go to the Baylands. I don't know. It seems to me like that Randy's going to need more staff to flush lines, or Diane's going to need help in the office to keep up on billing and stuff. So I think that some money does somehow in here at some point. Some money does need to get built in for the city.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thanks.
We are dealing with the term sheet. Okay. Jonathan, you've been waiting patiently. You want to come on up and provide some comments or feedback?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Council, Jonathan Scharfman, General Manager of UPC, and I want to wish you and yours a Happy New Year tonight.
Yeah, Rosh Hashanah, yes.
Just a few brief comments. First of all, we really do look forward to the thoughtful consideration that this body and the community will be placing into the land use element of what the future of the Baylands will be. That's to come, and my understanding is that very important discussion is going to be based on the technical elements that are in the environmental impact report that identify all the potentially significant environmental impacts of any development that will happen on the Baylands, and will give this body and the community some baseline information from which to make decisions. We're looking forward to that discussion happening. Our understanding is that state law requires that for any development on the Baylands, that there need to be a water supply assessment that has an identified potential potable water source. Whether it's the developer's sponsored proposal or the community alternative, there is currently no potable water that is allocated for that. So in planning for Brisbane's future, whatever that will be, a supply is necessary. And we did fund, as Randy Bro had mentioned earlier, an extension to a recycled water study that was done a couple of years ago by, I believe it was Carollo Engineers, that identified the costs and potential availability of recycled water from other municipalities. And as I recall, the cost of that water in the report was several $1,000s per acre foot, as I recall. My understanding of the cost of desalination is that at current technology, if you can get it approved, stands at about 3 times of the price that the OID water that's being contemplated in this agreement is, $1,500 an acre foot and up. So besides the costs involved, there really was a concern that we had that there be a source for any development that might get approved out on the Baylands that actually is cost-effective, has undergone thorough environmental review, so could actually be studied. Before I worked for UPC, I worked for a company that tried to get a private desal plant done for a single project in Monterey, and that was 10 years ago, and that project is still without water. Desal is a very, very difficult technology to get approved in the Bay Area, although it's being studied for good reason. So we think that the Oakdale Irrigation District has done a very responsible job of studying, of doing a multi-year study of its water resources and water management program that included an environmental impact report that identified ways that they can do improvements to their systems and allocate certain amounts of water for transfer, and the number that's been referenced, they're already transferring 15 to 20 times the amount that's being contemplated here, and they're doing it in a way that appears to be responsible. So we believe it's a good option. We urge the council to approve this term sheet and then take thoughtful consideration of the steps that are going to be required for you to have confidence that any water transfer agreement that you enter into with any other agency has the city's interests protected. I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Any questions for Jonathan? Ray?
You didn't answer the question that I posed for you earlier.
Please.
You remember that was the one where when you get to the 6th year, you have to sort of indicate what you think you're going to need for the next 45 years, and you have to stick with that?
Mm-hmm.
As I understand, that's the language.
Mm-hmm.
You're comfortable with that?
I anticipate, Councillor Miller, that we're going to have a very robust development agreement term sheet discussion that's going to outline the framework and obligations that UPC would be obliged to in order for the city to be comfortable proceeding with a development. In turn, there would be obligations the city would have of that agreement to assure us or banks or any institutions that are financing infrastructure and other improvements on the project that there is such a development to be part of our future, our reason for being here. And so in those discussions, which we hope would occur before year 6, I think we would get very comfortable with putting our arms around a number. And just to be clear about this, we're talking about a number that is, I believe, $1.2 million a year. Any development that happens on the Baylands is going to have numbers and obligations of the developer for infrastructure, for open space, for a number of other potential community benefits that potentially dwarf that. So this council or successive councils that are having that development agreement discussion with us will have to be very comfortable with what those terms are before you would proceed, and so would we.
But that presumes you have a pretty good crystal ball about the extent of development that's going to occur over particular time periods. It sounds to me as if you're saying, well, if the market crashes and we can't build what's been approved because there's no need for it, there's no demand for it, you're still going to be paying for the water. That's how I read it anyway. And you're saying, so no big deal?
I'm saying that I think that those development agreement term sheet discussions would inform whatever the final amount that was subject to the final water transfer agreement and the developer funding agreement that has been discussed would be better established. Today we're not really talking about a final number. We're talking about a state requirement to study the upper limit of what might be required.
I hear you, but I'm still puzzled by your response.
I'm happy to answer more questions if you have.
Karen? Ray, you finished, or you had another one for?
Well, that's the
Jonathan?
question I had for Jonathan at this point. Yeah.
Okay. Tara?
I don't have any questions for Jonathan right now.
Debbie? Clark?
No, thanks.
You got any other ones, Jonathan?
Not for Jonathan, no.
Okay.
At this point.
Let's do this. Why don't we take a little break, and then we'll come back and have council discussion. Right.